Hello and welcome. I'm Tom Burges Watson. You are watching W News, broadcasting live from the Arabiya News headquarters. These are our top stories. The death toll from these past 2 weeks of violence in Lebanon now exceeds 1,000. The Lebanese Prime Minister Najib Mikati says as many as 1 million people have been displaced. Israel continues to carry out airstrikes across Lebanon this Monday, including one deadly strike on a Sunni-majority area in the heart of Beirut. We'll be asking, does an Israeli ground invasion look like an inevitability now? Well, Hezbollah says it is ready for an Israeli ground invasion. The group says it will soon be announcing a new leader who will be replacing Hassan Nasrallah, who was killed on Friday. Welcome. More than 60 people have been killed in Israeli attacks across Lebanon since last night, including 3 members of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Well, the Lebanese Health Ministry reports that the death toll from an Israeli raid on the southern town of Ain al-Delb, which is east of Sidon, has now risen to 45. At least 75 others are injured. Additionally, the ministry confirmed that 12 people were killed and 20 others injured in an Israeli raid on the town of Bekaa, on a town in Bekaa, I should say, on Sunday night. Well, a Lebanese army soldier was killed in an Israeli attack which targeted a motorcycle he was riding through an army checkpoint close to the border. This marks the first soldier casualty reported since Israel began extensive bombing in Lebanon last week. Well, Israel's defense minister hinted today at a potential ground offensive in Lebanon.
We'll do what needs to be done. Our aim is to return residents of northern Israel to their homes. To return the residents of the north to their homes, we will be ready to make every effort. This is your mission. This is the IDF mission, and that's what we'll do. And we'll employ all of our capabilities, including your forces and other forces, from the air, the sea, and the ground.
Meanwhile, Hezbollah's deputy chief, Naim Qassem, says that the group is prepared for a long conflict following on from the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah. Lebanon's acting Prime Minister Najib Mikati said that the government is prepared to fully implement the 2006 UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which aimed to end Hezbollah's armed presence south of the Litani River as part of a ceasefire agreement with Israel. Meanwhile, Israel's foreign minister has indicated that a ceasefire will not be considered unless Hezbollah disarms.
Hezbollah will continue with its goals and their presence in the field. The Islamic resistance will continue to confront the Israeli enemy in support of Gaza and Palestine, in defense of Lebanon and its people, and in response to assassinations and the killing of civilians. We will face any possible attack, and we are ready. If the Israelis decide to enter by land, the resistance forces are ready for a ground engagement. We have prepared and got ready, and with our trust in God Almighty, we are confident that the Israeli enemy will not achieve its goals, and we will emerge victorious from this battle.
Naim Qassem of Hezbollah speaking there. Well, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu released a 3-minute video message today, which he said was aimed to address the people of Iran. Well, in this message, which comes 2 days after the killing of the Hezbollah leader, which, of course, Hezbollah is backed by Iran, Netanyahu said that nowhere in the region was beyond Israel's reach. He also said that, and I quote, Iran will be free a lot sooner than many people think.
There is nowhere in the Middle East Israel cannot reach. There is nowhere we will not go to protect our people and protect our country. With every passing moment, the regime is bringing you, the noble Persian people, closer to the abyss. Iran's tyrants don't care about your future, but you do. When Iran is finally free, and that moment will come a lot sooner than people think, everything will be different.
That was the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu there. Meanwhile, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said earlier today that the world is a safer place after the killing of Hassan Nasrallah. Blinken described the late leader of Hezbollah as, and I quote, a brutal terrorist. And he once again insisted that diplomacy is the best chance for peace in the Middle East. Well, for more reaction, I'm joined now by the former US National Security Advisor, General H.R. McMaster. Thank you so much for speaking to us, General McMaster. Can I just start by asking you whether you agree with what Antony Blinken said with regards to Hassan Nasrallah?
Absolutely. I mean, he's a brutal terrorist who has so much blood on his hands, not only American and Israeli blood, but Lebanese blood. I mean, I think this is an opportunity for the Lebanese people to be freed from Hezbollah. But we have to remember what happened to the Syrian people and how Hezbollah provided the shock troops that helped the Assad regime kill, wound, or displace half of the Syrian population. So I think this should be a happy day, not only associated with the death of Nasrallah, but so many of his top lieutenants, about 20 of the top leadership have been eliminated as well. And of course, while this is in the context of Israel attempting to get its population back into the northern parts of Israel, it will have important ramifications, as you know, Tom, across the region.
General, we're hearing as well that the United States is set to send a few thousand extra troops to the Middle East. That news is hot off the press. I'm just wondering what you think those extra troops will be doing there.
Well, I think it's to deter and, if necessary, to impose costs on Iran or to prevent Iranian responses and attacks. I think what we're beginning to see, Tom, is that Iran is actually quite weak. And Iran only appears strong when we try to de-escalate all the time with Iran. Iran, I think, is happy to expend every Arab life, every Lebanese or Palestinian life in pursuit of its twin aims to push the United States out of the region as the precursor for destroying Israel and killing all the Jews. And for those of us, and I think many of your audience, want an enduring peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. But you can't get there if you have empowered terrorist organizations who are committed to the destruction of Israel. That doesn't sound like a two-state solution to me, Tom. So I also look at the degree to which many resources have been diverted, away from the Lebanese people by Hezbollah. There's reputation of being a social services organization. But as we know, I mean, they're really a mafia organized crime network that's one of the largest drug trafficking organizations in the world. It's a human trafficking organization that enslaves women who they have captured in Syria, for example. The same thing with Hamas. I mean, I just think it's a missed opportunity. I wish that there was a television special, on the lifestyles of the rich and famous Hamas leaders with quick cuts to film of the destitute Palestinian population in Gaza. So I think it's time for all of us to advocate for an end to these terrorist organizations and to empower the people of Lebanon, the Shia population in Lebanon, and certainly the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank.
The situation in the region is developing extremely fast. I mean, faster than I think many of us could possibly have predicted. The last couple of weeks have been extraordinary. I've got so many things I want to ask you, but let me just ask you this. Benjamin Netanyahu said today, and I quote, "Iran will be free a lot sooner than many people think." He said that in that 3-minute message that he recorded and addressed to the Iranian people. I don't know if you had a chance to see that, but what do you think he means by Iran will be free a lot sooner than people think?
Well, I think he's speaking on the anniversary of the murder of Mahsa Amini by the police. And the continuing repression of the Iranian people. Remember, in the recent protests in Iran, some of the chants that you would hear is America's not the problem. The problem is right here. And I think there's a growing recognition that this theocratic dictatorship that is perpetuating these fitnas across the region and continuing to support, these terrorist and militia organizations that lie outside of government's control. And of course, I'm talking about Hezbollah, which is the model, but also the proxy army that Iran is assembling in Syria, or the Hashd-e-Shaabi militias in Iraq, or the Houthis in Yemen. I mean, look at the human suffering they're perpetuating. The Houthis get press because they attack shipping, but they're starving children to death. in Yemen with their in besieged communities there. So I think it's time for the world and for the Iranian, including the Iranian people, to say enough of this. This theocratic dictatorship that has enriched itself, with these bunyads, which are these sort of conglomerates that are staffed mainly by the children of the corrupt clerical order in Iran, are denying the Iranian people the great promise of what should be a very wealthy and a very prosperous country. So I think the time is now for the Iranian people to let their voice be heard. I mean, they don't. America, no other country is going to liberate the Iranian people. It's going to be their decision. And there's a lot against them, right, with the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, with the Basij and other tools of repression that the Iranian regime has in place. But we can only hope, right? We should hope that the Iranian people gain the strength, have the strength to really affect a change in the nature of that regime that has caused so much pain, so much suffering inside of Iran, but as you know, across the Middle East, Tom.
General McMaster, with regards to the situation on the border between Lebanon and Israel, is your prediction that a ground invasion by Israel is now an inevitability?
I think it is, Tom. I think it's inevitable, because you have 60 to 80,000 people displaced, where we saw the horrible attacks, the continued rocket attacks across the border, killing children in soccer fields. And of course, there are terrible civilian casualties in Lebanon as well. I think that really what has to happen here is a ground offensive, because actually, paradoxically, Tom, people don't really understand this, I think, is that a ground offensive will be a lot easier to discriminate between civilians and the Hezbollah infrastructure and Hezbollah terrorists. So I think a ground offensive is not only necessary, but is preferable to these strikes, which, of course, Hezbollah positions its rockets underneath people's houses. The bunker in which Nasrallah was killed was 3 stories under the ground at the bottom of an apartment complex. So these are people who use civilians as human shields. The only way to really discriminate without excessive civilian casualties, which everybody hates to see, is through ground force, I think.
And just lastly, General McMaster, you were, of course, U.S. National Security Advisor to President Donald Trump, who's got a reputation of being something of a deal maker. Were he to win back office, what are your thoughts? Would he be able to calm the situation, assuming that it hasn't already been calmed by then?
Well, I think he's been tough on Iran, right? Of course, he's been inconsistent on Iran after the Soleimani killing. There was a reluctance to respond to Iranian retaliation on the attack on the Al-Assad air base, the shoot down of a drone, the attack on the Saudi oil facilities, Aramco oil facilities. So he hasn't been completely consistent. But what he used to tell me all the time, Tom, is everywhere I look in the Middle East, everywhere there's a problem in the Middle East, Iran's behind it. So he understands what the return address is for all the violence and hardship in the region, and the return address goes right back to the mullahs and the RGC in Tehran.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for sharing that with us, U.S. National Security Advisor General H.R. McMaster. Thank you very much indeed.
Hassan Nasrallah was a brutal terrorist whose many victims included Americans, Israelis, civilians in Lebanon, civilians in Syria, and many others as well. During his leadership of Hezbollah, the group terrorized people across the region and prevented Lebanon from fully moving forward as a country. Lebanon, the region, the world are safer without him.
Now, every day for the past few days, people have been moving from the south of Lebanon and from the southern suburbs of Beirut to areas of the country and areas of Beirut that are deemed to be safer. Well, hundreds of thousands of people have been displaced, and the Lebanese Prime Minister says the actual number of displaced could be around 1 million. Well, schools and hotels are filled with people seeking safety, and for those less fortunate, they're having to sleep on the streets. Well, the few flights that are operating out of Lebanon are all full. These 2 people fled to Spain.
Yesterday they bombed Beirut. They bombed Beirut in the heart of Beirut, next to my aunt's building. Every day you have to wake up, make sure your friends, your family are okay. You tend to worry about a lot of things, but I wish nobody lives what we are living.
I'm relieved, but I'm so worried about who we left behind. We are so worried. It's not over yet. It just began.
Okay, well, let's get the latest from Lebanon, and we can speak to the Middle East correspondent for The Economist, who's based in Beirut. Gareth, Browne, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. I just want to start by asking you, do people there feel like a ground invasion by the Israelis is increasingly likely?
I think they do. I think it's a very, very dynamic situation. And had you asked me, just a few weeks ago, I think people here in Lebanon were quite complacent, and they didn't necessarily think that the war was going to expand. They assumed that Israel was not interested in an all-out war, in a comprehensive war, in a ground invasion. And that's all changed, I think, in the last 2 weeks or so. We've seen this Israeli decimation, frankly, of Hezbollah's senior military command and its political leadership, which obviously sort of reached that crescendo in the killing of Hassan Nasrallah on Friday. But I think even in the last few hours, this spectre of the prospect of a ground invasion has started to feel a lot more imminent, a lot more urgent, a lot more real. And I think the Lebanese from all over the country now are sort of despondent about the fact that this is probably going to get a lot worse before it gets better.
And just talking about what's been happening there today, there was an area of Beirut that was attacked today, the area of Kola, which is a Sunni majority area. It doesn't seem to have an obvious Hezbollah presence. I'm just wondering, what's the significance of that target and other places that have been struck during the last 24 hours?
I think the strike on Kola is very significant. I mean, it represents a broadening, a deepening, a widening of the war. Hitherto all of the strikes in Beirut had been in the Dahia, in these southern suburbs, where we know Hezbollah has traditionally had substantial support, substantial presence. They keep their weapons there. They keep their, there's bunkers under that part of the city. Kola is an intersection. It's where you go if you want to take the bus or the shared taxi to the north, or even to Syria. There's also a lot of Lebanon's migrant workers live there, Sri Lankans, Filipinos. And so, it was a very different place for them to attack. Now, Israel said it killed 3 PFLP Palestinian militants. And I think it's indicative. Israel is widening this war. Hezbollah is not the only target. It's going to take out any target it thinks it can get in that country, whether it's Hamas, fighters from other Palestinian groups, other Lebanese groups who decide that they're going to fight any ground incursion. The list of targets is widening. We're seeing Israel target everywhere. It's not just in the south anymore. It's in the Bekaa Valley. There's been airstrikes to the north of Beirut. The war grows by the day, by the hour.
Indeed. And we heard from the deputy of Hezbollah today, Naim Qassem, who talked about patience and urged the Lebanese public to be patient. I mean, that's a really big ask, isn't it? I mean, how is the Lebanese public sort of reacting? Are there signs of fractures? Is there any finger pointing? Or do people remain as united as they looked and sounded, let's say, a week or so ago?
No, I think in the early days of that mass displacement from the south, you saw solidarity, and I think you're seeing that start to fracture already. Anecdotally, I can tell you stories of people in the Christian parts of the city not wanting the Shia from the south or from Dahia to stay in their apartments or in their neighborhoods because they're worried that they might be targeted by Israel. And I think that is one of the most worrying things. Okay, this country is really on a knife edge. Hezbollah has been weakened dramatically, more than any Lebanese could possibly have imagined a few weeks ago. It's probably the weakest it's ever been as an actor for 20 or 30 years. Now, that presents opportunities for the Israeli state, perhaps for the Lebanese state and perhaps the Lebanese army to reclaim some of its authority, perhaps even expand some of its abilities. But it also means that there's something of a vacuum. And I think a big concern is that as this dust settles, it's okay, hospitality and friendliness and taking in these people from the south, it lasts. But if this is going to go on for weeks and weeks, months and months, then there's always a risk of sectarian tensions. And we all know, Lebanon's depressing and brutal history when it comes to these sectarian tensions, that civil war which lasted 15 years, fought largely along sectarian lines. So I think people are worried, and the longer this goes on, the more tension builds, not just between the Lebanese and the Israelis, but within Lebanese communities themselves.
All right, well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Gareth Browne, Middle East correspondent for The Economist. Thank you. Well, let's cross to Tel Aviv, and we can speak to our correspondent, Trent Murray, who is standing by for us. Trent, the French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot has been visiting Beirut today. France is, of course, a close ally of both Lebanon and Israel, and we heard the French Foreign Minister calling on Israel for a ceasefire again. But that's not looking likely at all, is it? And if anything, it looks like we're headed for another escalation and as we were just hearing there, a ground invasion.
Yeah, well, Tom, that certainly seems to be the way the trend lines are suggesting that they're tracking. I mean, certainly based on some of the rhetoric that we're hearing, both out of Israel, but also, of course, out of Lebanon. Both sides are really ratcheting up the rhetoric and the threats rather than trying to dial down the tension. Certainly, I think the visit today by the French Foreign Minister, as well as some of the telephone calls that we know have been taking place from Washington and other places, have been trying to get both sides to de-escalate. But what we're seeing up on the border here in Israel is they are continuing to amass their tanks and troops up on the border. Yoav Gallant, the defence minister here, visited some of those troops today, saying the next phase in Israel's war with Hezbollah was coming, quote, soon. And of course, we're hearing this reporting now out of the Washington Post in the US, which is telling us that Israel has informed the United States that a ground operation is coming and it's imminent. So certainly the signals would suggest that something is afoot there. We have seen in the past sort of 30 minutes or so as well a statement by the IDF posted on social media saying the commander of the Northern Force troops has approved operations and plans for any sort of incursion that might occur. So it sort of seems going into this evening that both the tension is ratcheting up, the rhetoric is ratcheting up, and just the facts on the ground based on we know that Israel is amassing troops and tanks up there. The facts on the ground suggest that certainly something seems to be in the works, which is why we know diplomats, as I say, are really just trying to bring both sides back from the brink here.
OK, and we heard earlier in the day Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu giving that address to the Iranian people. What was the main thrust of that message, do you think?
Well, look, it was a very unusual message, really, from the Israeli Prime Minister directed at the people of Iran. He effectively sent a message saying that Israel's disagreements is not with the people of Israel, but is with what he described as the regime in Tehran. And he said that people will be free in Iran a lot sooner than they think, which, many interpret that as suggesting they were encouraging some sort of regime change almost in Tehran. And he said effectively that there was no place in the Middle East that Israel could not reach, again suggesting that if it wanted to, Israel could strike deep within Iranian territory. So again, not just on the northern front with Hezbollah, but also with Iran, it seems the rhetoric coming out of Tel Aviv right now is one of ratcheting up the threats, ratcheting up the rhetoric, and suggesting that further military action is coming. It was an unusual message out of Tel Aviv today, directed at Tehran and also the people of Iran more broadly.
Yeah, I mean, the situation's moving so fast. I mean, even as you've been speaking, we've heard EU member states saying they want an urgent meeting of the UN Security Council. We've got the UN chief just saying now, one of his spokespeople saying he's absolutely against a ground invasion of Lebanon. And Trent, just going back to events closer to where you are now in Tel Aviv, Hezbollah claimed to have used a so-called Nur missile, that I believe is a ballistic missile, in one of its attacks on Israel today. Just tell us a little bit about that attack, what's been happening on the ground in Israel today, and how significant it is that Hezbollah should have used this type of missile.
Well, look, I mean, what it suggests, I think, is that Israel Hezbollah rather is trying to send a message, perhaps, to Israel that despite these 12 days of heavy bombardments targeting what it says are some of its rocket and missile storage facilities, that they do still possess the capability to fire off some of these ballistic missiles. Some estimates suggest that they have had an arsenal of around 40,000 of them that can travel between 160 and 300 kilometres. Well, considering that Tel Aviv, where I am, is only 150 kilometres from the Lebanese border, I just think it's a reminder of that enormous show of force that Hezbollah does still potentially have the ability to show here. I mean, there have been some discussions in Israel and media reports around just what percentage Israel has managed to take out of Hezbollah's missile arsenal. But I think really there is an understanding even here that despite these 12 days of operations, which they're quite buoyant about, that there are still a very large number of ballistic missiles that could not only overwhelm the Iron Dome system if they were fired in great number, but they could also then cause significant damage, and not just on the border communities up near the Lebanon border, but as you know, far down here as Tel Aviv. So look, again, you know, a pretty strong show of force by Hezbollah. There's, you know, also some suggestions when you're up in Lebanon. I was there last month. Is that quite often Hezbollah will fire rockets and drones and missiles to test the Israeli defence array, to potentially try and find some weak spots in it. So was this ballistic operation part of those types of tests? We just don't know. But again, you know, firing ballistic missiles into Israel just does the opposite of trying to dial down the tensions. And I think we've seen, obviously, Israel launch its own airstrikes again today on Beirut. And so these concerns just continuing to simmer around where all of this could lead.
OK, thank you so much. We're out of time. Trent Murray in Tel Aviv, thank you very much indeed. We've been talking here about what is a broadening conflict which stretches from the Palestinian territories to Lebanon, and which has also drawn in Iranian-backed groups in Iraq and Yemen. Well, today, Yemen's Houthis said that they plan to escalate their operations against Israel. This announcement comes the day after an Israeli attack on the Houthis there in Yemen, which the group says killed 5 people and left more than 50 others injured. Well, the Israeli attack came the day after the Houthis said they'd targeted Israel's Ben Gurion International Airport with a missile at the very moment that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was flying back from New York. Well, for more, I'm joined by the former US ambassador to Yemen. You served under President Barack Obama, and you were also Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs, Gerald Michael Feierstein. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us. It sounds, listening to that, the rhetoric, the latest rhetoric from the Houthis, that they're taking things up a level.
It's a pleasure to be with you. And yes, I think that the Houthis, unlike Hamas, unlike Hezbollah, aren't close to Israel. And presumably the Israelis don't have the same degree of intelligence about the Houthis that they have about those other organizations. So right now, the Houthis are probably feeling pretty secure. The Israelis hit Hodeidah again. This is the second time that they've targeted Hodeidah. But to be entirely honest, the Houthis won't be moved by any damage to Hodeidah. That's not something that is of great interest to them. So they perhaps see themselves, with everything that's happened with Hamas and Hezbollah, that they are the last man standing, if you will.
Yeah, and they don't seem to be at all deterred by the fact that the head of a much larger, arguably much more powerful organization, namely Hezbollah, was killed only 4 days ago.
No, I think that they probably don't. I suspect that they're probably taking some precautions to protect Abdulmalik al-Houthi, the head of their organization. But again, I suspect that they're feeling as though the Israelis cannot target them as effectively as they targeted the Hamas or Hezbollah leadership.
Help our viewers and me understand this. Why is Iran supporting the Houthis? What's their goal?
Well, it's a good question, and we really saw it begin to change during the Arab Spring in around 2012, 2013. The Iranians had initially, earlier, been pretty hands-off with the Houthis, but they began to switch provide greater training, provide greater material support for the Houthis. A few things may have motivated them. There may have been, of course, some ideological or sectarian interests that they had. But probably more significant is that the Iranians might have seen the Houthi ability to interdict shipping in the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb as potentially an additional layer of deterrence for Iran in the case that either the U.S. or Israel decided to target them, with the idea that the Houthis' ability to shut down shipping in that vital waterway would be something that might come in handy at some particular point. And of course, what we've seen over the last 9 or 10 months has in fact been a demonstration of that effect. The Houthis have been reasonably successful, at least in restricting shipping, if not stopping it completely.
Another question I wanted to ask you. The U.S. Special Envoy for Yemen, Tim Lenderking, says the U.S. is currently extremely concerned that Russia might supply anti-ship missiles to the Houthis in Yemen. I want to ask for your thoughts on that. Why would the Russians do such a thing?
Well, it would be crazy, of course, for them to do it. The analysis, the assumption would be that the Russians might be tempted to do that in some way as a strike back for U.S. and Western support for the Ukrainians in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and that this would be a way to distract international attention from what's happening in that theater of war. But of course, it would risk alienating key Russian allies or partners in the region, particularly the Saudis, the Emiratis, even the Egyptians, who would understandably be upset if the Russians helped the Houthis increase the military pressure on shipping in the Red Sea.
And just lastly, you were one of the people who spoke out against a decision by the Trump administration to designate the Houthis as a terrorist organization. At the time, it was considered a risky move. Some even called it pure diplomatic vandalism. Why were you so sure that was a mistake?
Well, I think that a number of former colleagues, U.S. diplomatic colleagues, as well as the international humanitarian community and the UN, saw that broad designation as a foreign terrorist organization as something that was going to affect innocent Yemeni civilians much more than it was going to affect the Houthis. And it was going to make it impossible, really, for international humanitarian groups to continue providing the essential assistance, food, medicine, other kinds of assistance that they were providing to the Yemeni people. And so when the Biden administration decided that they had no choice but to impose new sanctions on the Houthis, they tried to tailor it much more closely so that the vast majority of Yemenis were not damaged by the designation, and they've stuck to that since then.
And all the while, the people of Yemen are continuing to suffer, aren't they? And the Houthis' actions are making the prospect of a return to a peaceful life for the average Yemeni person an ever more distant prospect, aren't they?
Absolutely. And, I think that with everything else that's happening in the region and the world right now, we've lost sight of the fact that the humanitarian situation in Yemen continues to be extremely concerning, with a majority of Yemenis who are either malnourished or suffering from food insecurity, as well as the collapse of other kinds of vital social services, education, health, these other services. And even though there's been a ceasefire in place for about 2.5 years now. Fighting does still go on, and innocent Yemenis are still being killed or harmed by fighting between the two parties. So the war in Yemen is not over. Even though we don't read about it very much anymore, it's still there. It's still concerning. We still have millions of Yemenis who are living under threat.
So, Ambassador, here we are with the Houthis as defiant as ever. They say they're going to carry on with their attacks on ships in the Red Sea. I mean, how much of a threat, broadly speaking, do the Houthis pose to the region?
Well, it's a very good question. And of course, they've demonstrated, I think, over these past number of months that their capabilities are far greater than anyone had understood prior to that, and that they have been effective, and they continue to increase their effectiveness in attacking international shipping in the Red Sea, the Bab el-Mandeb, the Gulf of Aden. And of course, they continue to pose a threat to their neighbors, particularly to Saudi Arabia, even though there have been negotiations and a ceasefire in place. So the Houthis have proven over these past, we're now, of course, observing, this is almost 10 years since the civil war started in Yemen. We have seen the Yemenis improve their capacity, improve their capabilities, and they are a major military force in the region right now.
My last question to you doesn't specifically concern Yemen. It does, however, concern US diplomacy. We're just hearing from the US State Department a message. It says the US still supports a ceasefire in Lebanon, but at the same time, military pressure can at times enable diplomacy. As a former US ambassador, I'd like to ask whether you agree with that.
Well, it's certainly true as long as you have a very clear understanding of what your desired goal is and how military pressure is going to support achieving that goal. Military pressure in and of itself without a clear end game doesn't generally accomplish very much. So you need both sides of that equation. You need a clear political end state that you're trying to achieve with an understanding of what exactly are the steps that you're going to take to achieve that. And that's the big question right now. We understand and we can see on a daily basis what the Israeli military operations are accomplishing, but it's not at all clear that the Israelis have a very clear end state in mind, or whether the end state that they're seeking is actually realistic and achievable. And that's where the Israelis run the risk of incurring a great deal of damage, not only to their neighbors, but to themselves, without accomplishing very much in exchange.
OK, well, we're out of time. It's been really interesting talking to you. Thank you very much indeed. The former US ambassador to Yemen, Gerald Michael Feierstein. Thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure.
Before we leave you, let's get a reminder of our top stories. The death toll from these past 2 weeks of violence in Lebanon now exceeds 1,000. The Lebanese Prime Minister Najib Mikati says that as many as 1 million people have been displaced. Israel is continuing to carry out airstrikes across Lebanon this Monday, including one strike which hit a Sunni majority area right in the heart of Beirut. This, as observers say, that an Israeli ground invasion looks increasingly likely. And Hezbollah says it is ready for an Israeli ground invasion. The group says it can be announcing a new leader to replace Hassan Nasrallah, who was killed on Friday. Well, that is all we have time for. Up next, Hadley Gamble will be here. She's interviewing Russia's Deputy Prime Minister, Alexander Novak. And at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, do join Rosanna Lockwood for Global News Today. Amongst other guests will be the former FBI Director, James Comey. That's it from us. Thanks for watching.
Minister, thank you for joining me. Can you tell me if the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah will impact the price of oil?
Well, I think that the oil prices are affected by many factors. We're talking about the balance of supply and demand, the growth of the economy, the consumption. I mean, the forecasts, geopolitical factors play their role as well. They affect the markets. And the events which are occurring here and now in the Middle East are definitely affecting the market.
Do you anticipate that we'll see a bigger price spike?
I don't think that the prices are going to be fluctuating like they are right now.
This week, the Financial Times released a report in which they said that the Saudis are looking to increase production in December and move away from their $100 price target. Is that a problem for Russia?
Well, we are judging based on the difficulty of forecasting any prices. But this way or another, they're volatile. And this is an OPEC Plus agreement, which is in force, and we can see that everything is according to time schedules and to quotas when we're talking about the participant states. And I think that's a great factor in order to make sure that the prices are stable. Of course, they are volatile, we can see it, but this volatility, the way I see it, is not that large. And I think we won't see that much volatility here and now. At least now the market is more or less balanced, thanks to OPEC and the OPEC Plus agreement in particular.
We're talking about a perhaps sustained period of lower oil prices. Are you factoring that into your calculations?
You know, we have different forecasts and assessments, so everything is based on different scenarios when we're talking about our energy strategy. We also have optimistic ones, the best case scenarios, and the worst case scenarios, the basic ones. Anyhow, this way or another, we'll be reacting to the situation as it develops. But now we have the basic scenario, the stable prices, the agreements which exist here and now.
Is stable price good enough?
Well, the prices that we have in the markets here and now are, well, of course they are fluctuating, but I think that these fluctuations occurred before as well. But in general, when we're talking about average prices across the year, I believe that they reflect the balance of supply and demand. So we need to look at the bigger picture over the period, not only one single moment in time. So the average price is okay, and everything is based on the average price.
So Bloomberg has released a report that suggests that Russia is forecasting as much as a 14% drop in oil revenues over the next 3 years. Is that accurate?
Well, if we're talking about the revenue, it all depends on the prices which are going to be in the markets based on the current situation. But once again, here and now, we also consider the exchange rates of the ruble to other currencies and the ruble price of the revenue. And when we're forecasting the budgets, we're considering the balance in the markets, which is forecast by the experts in the markets. And of course, everything is based on the exchange rates of the ruble as well. More or less, the revenue is supposed to be on the same level, and it's all considered in our budget projections.
Tell me this in terms of the demand outlook. Is that your greatest concern?
There are different assessments of demand. The latest OPEC report was released literally just a few days ago, and it shows oil demand is growing and will continue to grow until 2050. Currently, the total demand volume is about 100 to 103 million barrels per day. And in the next 10 years, it'll grow at a relatively high rate of 1.5 million barrels per day before slowing down. However, in general, by 2050, over the next 25 years, experts expect that oil demand will increase by an additional 20 million barrels per day, and we share these estimates. I'd like to note that there were many skeptics who believed that there would be a peak in demand. In fact, if we consider the overall energy balance and look at it up to 2050, over the next 25 years, I believe we can quite confidently say that the peak demand for both oil and gas will not occur during this period. But why we are so confident is we see rapid growth of demand on energy in general in the world, and the demand is growing. First of all, electricity is in demand. So why is that? Because new modern technologies are being implemented. The technological nature of the economy is changing, and AI is consuming a lot of energy. The data processing centers, the search aggregators and engines are using a lot of electricity. ChatGPT, all of that is consuming a lot of energy, so it's actually 10 times bigger than Google's consumption of electricity. That's why the consumption is going to be exponentially growing. We're talking about electrification of transport. So the world is going to be demanding a lot of energy. And the renewable energy sources are not going to cover that, although they are developing. I think that the hydrogen share until 2050 in the whole balance is going to be dominating at least 2/3 when we're talking about the overall balance of the energy consumption. So the hydrocarbons are going to be occupying 2/3 of the share. I think this is a great future when we're talking about this industry, and I think that also there's a risk of underinvestment. So, due to that, we might have big problems because the demand is growing, and we need to think carefully on how we're going to provide for the demand in 10 years, because we need to satisfy the growing demand, and oil is going to be playing an integral part in this process. Indeed, here and now, we can see that there's more supply compared to demand. There are some capacities which are not used yet, but in 5 or 10 years, the picture's going to change, and we will have to search for these capacities to satisfy that demand. That's why we have to think carefully about it. We shouldn't think about today only. We need to think about the mid-term and the long-term.
So for you, the current price depression and the demand outlook is not a concern?
I don't see the problem in that. At least in the recent few weeks, the prices have been volatile. Yes, we can see it all the time. So it happens during every single period. Whatever you consider and take, I think things are going to go back to normal. We'll see the balance in the prices, which is going to be satisfactory to the manufacturers and exporters. As of today, this balance, well, judging by the results of the last year and this year, is about $80.
So what's happening in the Middle East, the escalation, doesn't concern you with regards to price?
Well, of course, I've been mentioning this as well. Geopolitics is one of the key factors which is affecting the market. But we can see that often there are moments when geopolicy affects it rather drastically, but then it becomes part of the baseline. So we're not seeing the volatility from that on. We've been there quite a few times before. And I think that the Middle East factor is already factored into the price.
Tell me about Chinese demand. When do you think we'll see that coming back online?
Well, first of all, we are now seeing continued growth in demand and energy resources in China, including gas and oil, despite the fact that renewable energy sources are also being actively developed and built. Yes, China's economic growth rates are down somewhat from what we saw in the previous 2 10-year periods. However, they are above the global average, and China continues to develop and be one of the centers of energy consumption. So we are as well. Russia is developing its relations with the People's Republic of China. We have a lot of joint projects that relate to the energy sector, and we see China as a partner with whom we will work in the energy sector.
What about Iran? I know you're headed there. What kind of projects are you working on with the Iranians?
Iran is our long-standing partner, both economically and politically. We've many areas of trade and economic cooperation with them, covering all spheres of the economy. Energy is one of the components of our cooperation. We're developing partnership relations on joint oil production. We're considering gas projects and investment projects, as well as the possibility of supplying so-called energy swaps in those regions of Iran where there is a need for those energy resources, although Iran itself is certainly one of the largest countries in terms of production of energy resources and hydrocarbons. Nevertheless, there are regional differences, and in particular in the north we see that they have a need. We could put these questions to the north, and we're in discussion with them now. As for other directions, well, if you look at the map, Iran is a base country in the transportation corridor from the Baltic to the Persian Gulf, Russia, Azerbaijan, Iran. The Persian Gulf is now one of the most key projects that we're considering as to be the development of this north-south transportation corridor. This is the future largest hub, respectively, and a short route for delivery of goods between different regions of the world. And we believe that this is such a major potential project that it can become an alternative to the Suez Canal for the transportation of goods. There is, of course, joint cooperation in agriculture, and we have other areas in industry. So this is a long-standing strategic partner for us.
As an alternative to the Persian Gulf, in terms of that corridor?
Well, I've already said that this will be the largest international transportation corridor. Many countries are interested in it. It's a short way to deliver goods from Asia-Pacific countries to the European part of the world and vice versa. Therefore, naturally, when new corridors appear, this is an alternative. But we have to take into account that trade in the world in general is developing. And we need to develop new corridors in order to ensure international trade.
Does that relationship with Iran cause problems in terms of your relationship with Saudi Arabia?
We don't have any problems in this regard. We're also developing partnership and friendly relations with our friends from Saudi Arabia. By the way, I head the Intergovernmental Commission for the Development of Trade and Economic Cooperation between Russia and Saudi Arabia. And my partner is Prince Abdulaziz, Minister of Energy and co-chairman of the Commission. So we not only cooperate in a multilateral format within OPEC, we also cooperate and discuss within the bilateral format of our relationship, the development of our economies, and not only energy. We have so many other areas of cooperation, including digitalization, nuclear energy, new exploration, production of equipment, technologies, housing, utilities, construction of new cities. We have agriculture, among other things. Therefore, with Saudi Arabia, we're now actively developing a dialogue, and the pace of mutual trade and economic equipment and turnover is growing. And we're also kind of developing relations with our partners.
So if Saudi Arabia decides to flood the market in order to maintain market share, that's not a problem for Russia?
Should we start guessing? I mean, we're working together. We have an agreement. I mean, there's a saying that, well, the guesses don't bring you anywhere. That's why we keep working based on the reality of which we're facing here and now. I mean, whatever the country is, we might think about another country which is going to develop additional barrels. Of course, the market's going to react, but for that we have agreements to avoid those complications.
So maintaining market share is more important than the price?
Well, you cannot think about this here and now. So, judging by the short span, I mean, we are decreasing the volumes when we understand that the capacities are much bigger in the world compared to demand. And I guess that we are actually giving this share of the market away from us. But once again, we have to look for a long-term opportunity in 5 years. Quite possibly, the demand is going to be scarce. So, I mean, the demand is going to be bigger and the supply is going to be scarce. So then it's going to shift. The balance is going to shift. So I don't think we have to be concerned about it that much, because when we're talking about exporter countries, the energy has to develop in them. The investments, the funding should be there as well. For that, we need to have prices which are going to be satisfactory. Satisfactory to exporters as well as importers. So the prices have to be high in order not to stall the process. And on the other hand, the investments have to be returned when we're talking about the development of new locations. So when we're talking about the processing, extracting, etc. So this is all about balance all the time. We need to maintain this balance in order for the energy sector, the market for those who are actually supporting the development of the economy, depending on energy. These sectors, these areas have to develop as well. New technologies have to be implemented there. We need to develop upstream and downstream, so they have to have investment resources and their potential.
The former president, Donald Trump, he used to talk about U.S. energy independence. Now he talks about U.S. energy dominance. You worked with him in the past, so did Saudi Arabia, to essentially create stability in oil markets. Are you prepared to do that again if he becomes president of the United States?
The US is a country which is a great manufacturer of energy resources as well. On the other hand, it also consumes a lot of energy resources. Of course, the policy of the US from the point of view of stimulating the production of hydrocarbons, or maybe decreasing their production, will of course influence the overall balance of the world. We don't know how things are going to turn out after the election, who's going to be elected, etc. So whatever the policy is going to be, this this way or another, we'll have to react to the global situation when it comes to the balance of demand and supply. We'll see what the policy is going to be. I mean, it's hard to say here and now. We've seen it quite well on several occasions. We've seen how the leadership of the US changes their opinions on their own energy policy, so we can't guess. So we'll have to judge by the facts and how things turn out.
But would you be willing to work with him to create stability in the market?
What exactly do you mean by cooperating? We've always been open to our relations. We didn't terminate those relations, energy relations. It wasn't us who did that. We had good relations back in the day. It was the US that actually prohibited our supply of energy resources. I mean, it wasn't our decision. Why are you asking me? Ask those who actually made those decisions.
I think that was because you invaded Ukraine, but beyond that, going forward, if there's an opportunity to stabilize the market, do you think it's important that you work with the United States to do so?
Let me emphasize that. We are always ready to work with any country. We never terminated those relations with anyone ourselves. I mean, if there is an interest and a willingness, we are ready to cooperate.
You mentioned the investment that you're working with Saudi Arabia. Obviously, you were chief architect of the OPEC Plus agreement. Is there anything in your mind that would change that partnership going forward?
Well, first of all, I'll remind you that we have agreements until the end of 2025. Earlier, we decided that regardless of whether there will be a deal or not, we'll have a so-called Charter of Cooperation in the energy sector as a whole among the exporting countries. Like there are such charters in the gas industry. There's such an organization as the Forum of Gas Exporting Countries, where we'll constantly have a dialogue about the current situation, about the directions of energy development and what modern technologies will be introduced. We'll analyze the situation and there'll be a standard set of measures to develop the market. Well, for now, we're living on the basis of the agreements that we have. And then we'll see how the market situation develops. And perhaps we'll decide to extend our cooperation and limit production at this level or at another level. It'll depend on the market. I believe that this is an effective tool, and so far it allows us to smooth out volatility in the market. If there was no OPEC Plus deal, we'd have seen very large swings in the market, also related to the pandemic, when demand collapsed very badly. If there'd been no deal, and we hadn't cut 10 million barrels a day, then all of the OPEC Plus countries together, we would have seen a crisis in the energy industry. And that would have been a very significant impact, in my opinion, on the recovery of the entire world economy after the pandemic. It would have taken much longer because of what we saw in the oil sector. I remind you that prices in the United States, if you remember, were going into negative territory. It was more expensive to store oil than it was to even produce oil. So prices could be in the negative. The balance sheet was so on the verge of production exceeding demand by 15 to 20 million barrels, and by market means alone, this equalization would have been very long. A lot of businesses would have collapsed, and how long it would have taken them to recover is unknown. And we would have just gotten a global energy crisis. That is why this deal is effective. It once again allows us to smooth out the sine wave of volatility.
Поэтому сделка эффективна, она, еще раз повторяю, позволяет сглаживать синусоиду волатильность.
So it works for now.
Как вы видите.
As you can see.
If the interests of Saudi Arabia and Russia diverge, can we see changes to that agreement?
Мы, еще раз повторю, что мы...
Let me reiterate that. Now we have agreed on some of our strategic approaches for the next year and a half, until the end of 2025. And our key task is for all exporting countries to monitor the market situation and have stability. Well, I don't want to discuss some virtual things that may or may not happen. The question is, why should we be concerned about it?
Because it has to do with your economy and the survival of your state. So, of course, it's of concern.
Ну, хорошо, мы...
Okay, well, definitely, if the situation in the markets changes, we'll adapt to it. Our economy, as you can see, is very resilient, and it's proven its sustainability during the pandemic and during the sanctions which are actually imposed on our country. It's a record-breaking amount of sanctions. I mean, we don't even count them anymore, dozens or thousands. But last year, the economy grew by more than 3%. It's actually more than the average in the world, more than Europe, more than the US. This year, in 7 months, the terms of growth is 4.4%. So the speed of growth is like this. We'll do everything in order to provide for the growth of our economy, whatever the situation is, to improve the lives of our citizens.
So economists who say that Russia can't survive a sustained period of lower prices like we're seeing now, they're wrong?
You know, I want to say that in general, strategically, we are reducing the dependence of our economy on hydrocarbons, on oil, on gas. If earlier, for example, budget revenues were more than 50% from the export sales of our energy resources, now they are less than 30%. We're developing other sectors of the economy, and we're stimulating them. First of all, high-tech sectors of the economy such as medicine, pharmaceuticals, production of equipment, machinery, airplanes, ships, and then there's microelectronics. These are the areas that give us new added value, and they're developing. Therefore, we are reducing our dependence on price volatility on world markets, depending on how the situation develops. Of course, even 30% is a lot, although it used to be 50%, and the share will further decrease because our non-oil and gas revenues are growing faster every year than oil and gas revenues. So when we meet you next time, I think the situation will be even less dependent on world energy markets.
So those economists are wrong.
Each economist has their own opinion. I mean, I don't know which economists you're talking about right now, so we hear different opinions on the economy. I mean, there are economists who are forecasting the growth of the global economy for each state, Russia included, and they're changing their assessments 10 times a year. I mean, they just adapt their forecasts to the facts.
So just again, lower oil prices are not bad for Russia.
We'll survive any price.
In a world driven by constant change, understanding the news has never been more essential.
At Al Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines, bringing you the stories that matter from every corner of the globe.
With trusted journalism and deep insights, we provide you with the context and analysis that help you see the full picture.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
And conversations with those shaping the future.
We deliver the knowledge and perspectives you need.
Al Arabiya News,
where knowledge
meets perspective.
Hello and welcome. I'm Riz Khan. This week, it's the family feud which became America's uncivil war. Uncle against nephew, Donald versus Fred, Trump versus Trump, and now Democrat versus Republican. Donald Trump's nephew, Fred III, talks to me about the assassination attempts, political violence, eating pets, why he's campaigning for Kamala Harris, and why he can never forgive his uncle's treatment of his disabled son. Fred, great to have you on the show. Now, let's start by talking about your son, William. I'm a huge fan of the musician Peter Gabriel. I think that's something I share with both you and William. Tell me about that.
I hope Peter's listening, because when people say Genesis is my favorite band, I said, you have no idea what you're talking about, Genesis. Genesis is Peter Gabriel.
I will send him an email. Tell him.
Oh,
now, tell me about how because you talk about "Road to Joy" being William's favorite song.
Yeah, it really is. William, and thank you for asking. I really appreciate when people ask about William, he's really one of the reasons why I wrote this book. He's 25 years old. He is severely disabled, needs assistance with virtually everything he does. And we're blessed by having such great people that work with him on a daily basis. In fact, many of whom are Haitian. And I'm sure you've been following what's going on here in Springfield, Ohio. And I can just let people know the Haitian community is wonderful. And they are helping to make my son the young man he is. William loves many things, one of which is music. And when Peter came out with that song last year or earlier this year. He just loves it every time he hears it. It's one of he needs assistance again walking when he's out of his wheelchair, and that's one of the songs that he just loves walking to.
And I know, I'm listening to the audio version of your book, so I'm hearing you tell the story, and I realize how important family is to you specifically. And the thing is that Donald Trump, your uncle, his treatment of William was at the center of one of the most shocking moments in your book. So just tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, if I can quickly go back, if you don't mind, Riz. Sure. When Donald was elected, my wife reached out to my cousin Ivanka. We knew that this would be our opportunity to take our advocacy of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities to a new level. It culminated in a meeting in the White House, in the Oval Office, and Donald attended, which I very much appreciated. And we spent about 45 minutes going through the issues that were important to us, including ways that we could save money and yet get better services for the disabled. When the meeting ended, I was called back in to see Donald, and Alex Azar, the head of Health and Human Services, was in the room. And Donald says, "Hey, pal, how's it going?" And we chatted for a minute, and he said, "Those people, the costs, they should just die." I obviously really didn't know what to say, so I just said, "Thanks very much. I'll talk to you soon." 3 years later, I needed to talk to him about William. And he just said, "He doesn't recognize you. Let him die and move to Florida." Now, I don't know how one person could say that about another human being, least of all his grandnephew. And it's important to note that Donald had never asked to meet William and never has met William. So how he knows that my son wouldn't recognize me is beyond me. William certainly recognizes me, and he recognizes every person in his life.
And Fred, that makes me wonder, as hurtful as that comment could it be something that Donald Trump might have said on the spur of the moment and perhaps even regretted afterwards? Or do you think it's more a reflection of an aspect to his character?
Oh, I think there's no regret. And when the book came out, there was, some releases from my cousin Eric and even Donald and the campaign. Not once did they acknowledge that comment. So he has no empathy whatsoever. And as you said, you've been listening to the audiobook, so you know how he treated my father. It just doesn't exist, whether it's family or it's not family.
And that's the thing that you describe how you're basically cut off financially. And I wonder what the financial impact of that family feud has been on your ability to care for William.
Well, we will get through it. And we have, as I said, some wonderful people in our lives that help take care of William. We look for, our state assistance financially for William and for all the disabled community. William is now in a group home. We work with an organization since William was in their Birth to 3 program. So again, he's 25 years old. So we rely on the state, as do, throughout the country, millions and millions of people. This is a very large community. And as I say, if I have a national stage, and frankly, apparently an international stage, I've been speaking to folks in Australia. I'll be talking at the Canberra Writers Festival in October, the UK, Canada, and it always comes up as such an important issue, the disability issue. So I'm out there doing what I can to, again, just to advocate on a group of people who, for the most part, is voiceless.
All right. We have a global reach, and I know that even here in the Middle East, that's become a much bigger issue that people are paying attention to now. I have to ask you, though, Fred, despite your differences, some would say family is family. And when a member of your family is the focus of not just 1, but 2 assassination attempts, how do you react?
Right. Well, I'll just say what hopefully everybody that has the opportunity to say and should think. There's no place for political violence in our country or in any country. So let's just get that out there. I was horrified when I heard about the first attempt. And several hours later, I reached out through Donald's assistant and put out a statement to her saying, Lisa, my wife, and the kids, we are all thinking about him. We hope he's okay, and please pass along the message. And she got back to me pretty soon and said, will do. So, yeah, I was horrified by that.
Has carrying the Trump name ever made you the target of political violence, and has the book perhaps increased that risk?
When Donald first started running in earnest in 2015, when his first real policy, if you could call them prescriptions, were anti-immigrant. Now, we have a lot of folks, you may hear the lawn mowers going in the background, a large migrant community, legal migrant community in where I live. And we had dead animals thrown on our lawn. We had reporters coming to our house unannounced, cars that would pull up in our driveway and then pull away, or stay at the end of the street and just, sit outside our property for, hours at a time. And that is really one of the reasons why I held back in writing the book, because William was still living at home at that time. My other two who are older, Andrea's and my older son, Christopher, they were in college at the time. And then as soon as they graduated, they both moved into the city. But William was here. So when he moved into the group home, and after January 6th, that's when I really said to myself, I've got to do something. And again, January 6th was just it should never, ever happen again. It should not have happened in the first place. And that's when someone asked me the other day, have you ever been embarrassed by your family name? And sure, there have been things in the past that, Donald's just kind of nuts. He just talks crazy talk. But this was dangerous. This was violent. And to me, that was an embarrassment for as people will say, my nuclear family.
In your book, you give a very clear description of your family history. It's very engaging, and a lot of it is about your father and the story of the Trump family through his eyes as well, which is very engaging, as I say. And I know you've dedicated your book to the memory of your father. Many people will, though, assume that the timing of its publication will be to perhaps even harm Donald Trump's campaign for re-election.
It wasn't the intent at all. I mean, this is unlike any other book written by anybody. This is just a truthful book, again, to honor my dad, who was a very caring and charismatic guy, and William, who is the bravest and inspirational person I know. And I figured I can't tell the story of those two without telling the story of the Trump family, complicated like every other family is, and sometimes cruel. And, Donald happens to be the central figure in the family. So he obviously played a large part in it. This is told, again, by somebody that's known him my entire life. Nobody has written a book with the personal stories, truthful stories that I've laid out.
Well, I was going to say the Trump name, of course, is constantly in the news now as we approach the election. And I wonder what you made of Donald Trump's debate with Kamala Harris. And there was a lot of focus on crowd sizes and immigrants eating pets and so on.
Yeah. The crowd size, he's always been that way, that it has to be the joke when he was starting to, in earnest, build buildings in Manhattan. Trump Tower, he claims, is 68 stories tall when it really is 46 stories tall. I was at the inauguration in 2017. I can assure you that was not the largest crowd that was ever seen at an inauguration. All the reports from respected news organizations had it right. It was not the largest crowd ever. As far as the cats and dogs thing, and this happens, you see it all the time. He will double and triple down. And, his sidekick, J.D. Vance, is doing it too. And I was interviewed on a local radio station in Atlanta, Georgia. I said, the word is out that Donald's going to go to Springfield. You know what? I'm going to go to Springfield, and I'm going to talk with the Haitian community and let them know my thoughts of how special they are, how hardworking they are.
Do you know, it's interesting you mentioned that because you talked about that at the beginning, saying about Haitians and how valuable they've been in your life, especially with looking after William. There's been a backlash against the Haitian community as a result of Donald Trump's remarks. Do you think that he'd even know about that or worry about that?
Oh, he doesn't. He knows about it and he doesn't care. He just doesn't care. In fact, you know, he will use them as props for now. It's just another group legally in this country, by the way, through a program set up by a Republican, George W. Bush. So those folks are legal. They're hardworking. And one of well, there are many disturbing parts. In fact, the entire Project 2025 is disturbing, is the ability that they will have to, I guess the word is denaturalize people and send them back, not just to their country of origin, but to wherever they want to. Very sick, twisted thoughts.
You know, there's a section also in the book where you're talking about the earlier years and you refer to Donald Trump using the N-word after his car was damaged. Were you trying to imply that perhaps he's racist?
I was implying that not just the fact that he used the word twice in my presence, but maybe the larger story is that he did not know who actually did it. So he just assumed it was black people doing it. Does that make him racist? I can't tell you whether he is or not. Lately, he's really been pressing it, and so is my cousin Donnie, which I am very sad to see them do this. They're hanging out with really bad people who spew racist profanities and beliefs, like this Laura Loomer lunatic. I don't know why he hangs out there, but his base eats it up and they love it, and they'll never change. You know, they will never change. They will follow him to the end.
Fred, I should say, of course, that Donald Trump's team has dismissed the book as a pack of lies and exaggerations intended to grab publicity. I'm wondering what sort of feedback you've had directly from your wider family, perhaps even Donald Trump.
Nothing personally. Nothing personally.
Now,
which I expect. I'm sorry.
All right, no, I apologize. I will say, you've announced your support for Kamala Harris. I mean, did you already have political differences with the Republicans, or is the appeal simply that Kamala Harris is not Donald Trump? And what do you fear the most from a second Trump presidency?
First of all, I'm a political junkie. I have followed politics, well, since I was an early kid, when my two early heroes, Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, were assassinated. For me, it's always policy over politics. So I have always voted for Democrats, even if they don't go all the way to what I want or what I think is appropriate for either a city or a state or a national election. And I'm doing that now. The Harris campaign has the policies that I believe in. I think she is the person, and her administration will keep this country moving forward, because America is great, but we need some issues to be changed and handled. And I'm confident that she will do that. As I say, I'm out there advocating on behalf of folks with disabilities, and I will be holding their feet to the fire to ensure that happens. Regarding if Donald is elected, let's put it this way. Even if Donald is not elected, we're already seeing some local election boards saying they will not certify their local elections if Donald does not win.
There are those. I was going to say, Fred, there are those who believe that perhaps in the first presidency, Donald Trump wasn't necessarily wanting to do the job of being president, that he just liked the idea of being elected by the American public as president. But it's going to be a different story if he gets in now. He knows what's involved and what he can and can't do.
Yeah, it's funny you bring that up, because I was in the Oval Office many times, and there were several occasions where he was acting like the New York business guy. You know, I want this done. And for lack of a better word, the bureaucrats would come in and say, you can't do that. And he would go nuts when someone would say he couldn't do things. That is why when people, certainly Donald says he has nothing to do with Project 2025, that's nonsense. It's like him saying he had nothing to do with the building of Trump Tower. That will give him the ultimate power he wants, where he can say, I want this done and I want that done. And his minions will take the lead in making sure that happens.
Now, listening to your narrating of the audiobook, which is how I'm following the story, it sounds sometimes like you're trying to be perhaps a little diplomatic in the way you phrase things. Did you have to hold back much?
I like to say, and I have said in the book, that I'm a different kind of Trump. I always was trying to be, yeah, you say diplomat, that's a good word. I said I tried to be the Kissinger, even though I didn't necessarily agree with everything Henry Kissinger did, but just trying to bring the family together. And as I said again on another interview, that, I want to go out there and talk to people and let them know that not every Trump has these very dark dystopian views. Let's get out there and start a dialogue and try to bring some civility back. I'm happy to speak with any group there is. I don't even like to use the word group. I'm out there. I want to talk to anybody.
And yet you, in some of the early stories that you recount, it seems that what you knew of your Uncle Donald was that, there were some good moments too.
Oh, hey, he and I share a passion of golf, and he's the one who got me into playing golf. I remember that clearly. And we played many times over the years and enjoyed all of them, including when he would change his handicap in the middle of the round or have his caddy kick the ball out from under a tree. But I enjoyed those times. I wish, and in the end, getting back to the disability part, he was the most powerful person in the world as president of the United States. It would have been, I'll use the word gracious of him, to reach out to me and say, I know what you and Lisa are going through with William. And I understand, Fred, that you have told me that millions and millions of people in this country are suffering. I'm going to do whatever I can to help you and your cause and get things done. It never happened.
Have you killed that prospect of using that platform of having an uncle as president now that you're essentially voting for the other side?
It would be hypocritical of me not to reach out to him if he is elected, honestly, not to try to do it the second time around.
I was going to ask you, Fred, obviously you've known him from childhood. What would you say are the greatest changes you've observed in your uncle over the years?
He's gotten so much nastier than he ever was. Sure, he had a mean streak, and that was all about him projecting power to get what he wanted, as I've said before. But it's just taken on a very nasty, dangerous tone to it. And if you listen to it all the time, he can't help but demean people, anybody. It makes him feel good. It, as I say, it amps up his base. And it's, I'll use the word again, it's embarrassing, some of the things. I wish he's not going to stop. So if anybody thinks he's going to change, it's not going to happen. So buckle your seatbelts, because it's going to be a very intense 47 or so days left. And I hope the Harris campaign, who I've asked to help in any way I can, they're ready for it, because it's going to come thick and hard.
I have to say, Fred, that your book, All in the Family, is a great kind of scene setter of how the family develops, obviously through your eyes, and how Donald Trump kind of developed his character as well. And is it true that Donald Trump's daughter, Ivanka, was helpful to you in researching the book? And, I mean, have you heard from him or any of his kids, your cousins, since you published?
When I was looking to write this book in the fall, pretty much actually almost a year ago, it's hard to believe, honestly, I reached out to Donnie and Eric and Ivanka with some thoughts I had. And one of the original thoughts, along with doing honoring Dad and William. And by the way, my dad's the anniversary of his passing is coming up on the 26th of September. I had this maybe utopian view of, our family has become a very polarizing name, not just in the country, but in the world. Why don't we start thinking about your kids, my kids, and future generations of Trump, how we can change things? And to her credit, Ivanka was the only one who got back to me. And I made a pledge to her. I said, I would never use anything that you sent me in a book without letting you know. And when she heard about the book being published, she emailed me. We've never had a very close relationship, unfortunately. I look back at that as kind of a sad part of this. But I said, Ivanka, I told you I would only put stuff in if I had your okay. We wound up not using anything of Ivanka's, her couple of pages that she got back to us. Very thoughtful stuff, and I do appreciate it.
I'm wondering, Fred, have you had a chance to see the new movie, The Apprentice? And I'm wondering what you think movie makers, in the media most commonly get wrong in their understanding of Donald Trump.
Well, I never saw an episode of The Apprentice, so I'm not going to go see the movie. I think what they're going to get wrong is Mark Burnett, who was the brains behind The Apprentice, knew that Donald's career really wasn't as good as Donald thought. I mean, they had to really prep him and advertise him as some great success, even though Donald had bankrupted many of his companies. If you Google Trump brand, it's sort of at the bottom of the barrel. But Mark saw something, and it was a huge success. There's just no doubt about it. But I would think that's one thing people really don't understand is Donald was never really a great real estate or business tycoon.
I think there's research that says now, though, in terms of leaders and characters that are very visible, people seem to want very strong characters, whether they're good or bad. They seem to gravitate towards them.
Yeah, I read some article years ago when I was really grappling how Donald got to where he was in 2015, the populism. And I don't want to play armchair psychologist, but it was basically people like to be lied to. And I think that may be what you've seen over the past number of years. They just, Donald will say, hey, you're great, and the group below you is not great. And I call it trickle-down hatred, if you will, or trickle-down cruelty. And that's what it's all based on, is him demeaning people to make others feel good. And of course, he is the top of the chain.
In Hollywood, it seems everyone loves a happy ending to a family drama. Do you ever really see any hope of reconciliation within the family?
I think the only reconciliation, strange as it may seem, is between Donald and me. I don't think I'll ever have a relationship with my cousins again, which also is a shame. It's interesting, if you want a potential happy ending, many people have said, Fred, you need to turn this book into a movie. So maybe watch out, Riz.
Well, do you have, has there been a time you ever celebrated together? Have you given each other a Christmas present? Anything like that?
We haven't done that in decades. Christmas, when my grandparents became very old, the family Christmases and Thanksgivings sort of petered out. Now they're all held down in Donald's house in Palm Beach. I have my wonderful family here, Lisa, Andrea, Christopher, and William, and we love celebrating together or, bringing in friends, which is very important to us.
And it sounded like it started with your grandparents actually creating that kind of split with all the kids.
Yeah. Christmas and Thanksgiving were not the most warm and friendly and cuddly times of the year. And it's not even a half joke. It's a joke that one great benefit is nobody wanted to be around each other for more than an hour or so. So it may not have been the most wonderful time, but it was over pretty quick.
As we wrap up, Fred, I want to ask you to reflect on the thought, is the name Trump a blessing or a curse for you?
Oh, it's been a curse. But that being said, if I can use it for good, and I intend to with my wife, Lisa, okay, I'll use the Trump name. That's fine. I'll take the slings and arrows as long as my kids are kept out of it. That's fine with me.
Well, listen, Fred, it was great talking with you. I wish you a good time remembering memories of your father as the anniversary comes up. All the best to you and your family.
Thanks. Same here. Take care. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. Bye. Take care.
Welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday on Al Arabiya News. I'm Rosanna Lockwood, coming up on the show. Former FBI Director James Comey shares his insights on the upcoming US election, the presidential candidates, and the future of American democracy. With personal ties to Gaza, Scotland's former First Minister Humza Yousaf shares his thoughts on the humanitarian challenges in Palestine and the role of the international community in brokering peace. As Israel shows no sign of reaching a ceasefire deal, I speak to the UK former Minister of State for the Middle East for his reaction to the conflict. Well, to the US election now, where the majority of Americans will go to the polls in just about 5 weeks to decide who will become the 47th president of the United States. As we approach the election, with Donald Trump once again a major contender and Kamala Harris playing a prominent role as vice president, with polls indicating a tight race. Well, earlier I spoke to former FBI Director James Comey to get his insights into the state of democracy, the security of the electoral process, and the future of American politics. Sir, thank you for your time, Mr. Comey. Look, this is the second book in a trilogy that you're writing, as far as I understand. I think the first question to ask, for those who know you as James Comey, former director of the FBI, is what's led you to crime writing?
The nudging and pushing of the editors of my nonfiction work. They said I ought to give it a try. I resisted. They pushed. I resisted, then finally decided to try, and I've found it addictive. The chance to show people some of the worlds I've known through fiction, but with a very real sense of how things work. It's been fun. What
do you think your editors saw in you that they thought, you know what, James is going to write some great fiction work for us?
Well, they said that I wrote narrative well and I wrote dialogue well. They kept referring to things that had happened in my actual life as scenes, and I kept telling them, these aren't scenes, this is my life. But they said you ought to try because you're able to write in a way that people find interesting. And so far, so good. This is what I want to do when I grow up.
Very good. Well, truth is stranger than fiction, as the saying goes, and you've certainly experienced a lot. Let's stick with the books for a moment, because you called your first one Central Park West. This one is called Westport. Those are places, are they places that resonate with you?
Yes, they're places that I've worked and investigated and know well. And so in the first one, which is mostly focuses on political corruption and the mafia, two things I spent a lot of time grappling with as a federal prosecutor, I wanted to put people in the neighborhoods that I know. And the same thing with Westport. It's based in a financial management firm, a hedge fund. I happened to work at one for 3 years before I became FBI director in a place called Westport.
You did, indeed. Your time at that hedge fund has actually been chronicled in a very interesting article by, I think, Vanity Fair recently. You were the in-house counsel there?
Yes, I was the chief lawyer.
Interesting. Look, in terms of catharsis, do you think you're getting some from this now? You've mentioned already, sort of nudgingly, winkingly, perhaps, that some of the experiences you've had, some people would call scenes. They're so strange. Do you think there's some sort of therapeutic thing to writing them down now as fiction?
I don't know, maybe. I mean, for me, mostly what I enjoy is to take people inside the worlds that I, in this weird journey of my life, have been inside. Federal prosecutors, the FBI, the world's largest hedge fund. But again, do it through fiction so people don't think I'm writing a secret biography of a place I was. And that frees me up to show people the way it really is. In an odd sense, fiction is freeing. And I think it's exciting without me having to make up stuff. A lot of fiction has people like the FBI director jumping out of helicopters. That doesn't happen. But there's a lot of excitement in the work without making things up.
Would anybody from your previous life, in your role as FBI director, or even from your hedge fund days, recognize themselves as a character in any of your books?
They're all trying to see if they're in there.
I bet they are, yeah.
I've told them, dude, you're not in there. But I've taken pieces of people and combined them to create characters. And I've told friends what parts of them they can look for in what characters, but I'm not going to say that publicly.
Look, you previously have said it was never your goal to become famous, and that's probably understandable, being, you know, with your former prosecutorial background, law enforcement, but you became director of the FBI, so you knew you were going to get this major platform. But you then became more famous, of course, with the presidency of Donald Trump, and of course we'll come on to that. But is this your way of now using this platform despite not ever having wanted to be famous?
Maybe a little. I mean, obviously the advantage that the publishers see in having my name on the cover is that people might recognize the name and pick up the book and read it. But they're only going to keep reading if the books are good, and I think they are. I mean, I guess it's easy for me to say I'm the author, but in part, sure, the identity gives me a leg up over folks who are less well known.
What's it been like entering the world of publishing from the kind of career that you had? I mean, you had a bit of a pause, assuming, you know, post your big public role, post DC, time to come down, and then you've entered publishing. What's that been like?
It's been fun because I'm a bit of an introvert, and it allows me to work alone. I spend a lot of my time just sitting on my back porch, writing on a laptop, and to use my family to help me write better. My wife is my partner in this, gives me awesome feedback and ideas, and so do all 5 of my kids. So that's made it a family affair and a quiet one, which I've really enjoyed.
That sort of sings to me, you saying you're an introvert, because I am too, and people often think, well, how can you be that way if you're a news anchor? They probably thought that way. How can you be that way when you're when you were the director of the FBI? So what would be your answer to that, how an introvert operates in that type of role?
I heard somebody say that describe themselves as a socially adept introvert, and that's kind of what I am. Is I can do it, and I have to do it. I have to shake hands. I have to talk to a lot of people when I'm FBI director. But maybe it fits better for an introvert because you don't crave the attention. You don't get energy from the exposure. I used to have to go home at the end of the day and just stare at a tree after a long day as FBI director. And so maybe that's healthier than some of the people we see in public life who are hungry for affirmation and feed on it. Introverts don't. I know you get this, but people who aren't introverts probably don't realize how little you crave the attention.
Oh, you're telling me you're going home to stare at a white wall generally and blocking everything out just to reset for the next day. What's it been like then, stepping out of that introvert bubble, if you like, that recovery from that public profile, and now doing news interviews about your book, about your writing, but also, I suppose, going on book tours and doing signings?
Yeah, I do it because it's necessary, and I also enjoy the interactions with individual readers who have liked the books and want more. And I've actually just signed a deal to write book 4 and book 5. I'd originally thought it would be a trilogy, but it's done well enough. The publisher wants at least 5 focused on my protagonist, Nora Carlton. So I've enjoyed those interactions. I still have to go and stare at something at a blank wall, like you said. But my favorite part is the part that people can't see, where I am alone or just talking to my wife or kids about how to make a chapter or a sentence better.
What do your kids make of the books?
They were cringing, as they would say, at the idea of me getting out there and writing these books. They've enjoyed them. They've helped make them better. They know that I've tried in my protagonist to take pieces of my kids and combine them into a character that I can close my eyes and not only love, but picture. And so they've helped me keep that right. They've helped me with the details. They've helped me with the language. So they feel part of it in a way that I think is good and fun.
And you've also written, female characters, very well-rounded, kind of in-the-world female characters. Do you think your background, FBI background, had something to do with that? Obviously, FBI profiling, that type of thing. I'm not likening women here to serial killers, of course. But that type of thing, getting in the mind, the psychology of other types of people, do you think that's helped you sort of write for a woman?
I don't think the FBI helped me with that. I think being married to an amazing person who's also trained as a marriage and family therapist, I should add, not because of me, but because of her broader interest in helping, especially children. And in a household of 5, 4 of whom were girls, I've learned a lot and learned to see the world in a different way than just being trapped in this person that you're talking to today. So I don't think it was the FBI. I think it was sort of the training that began for me when I met my wife in 1980.
How lovely. Look, I know you've described it as icky, and I know it's an icky topic, but of course we can't speak to you, Mr. Comey, with the oncoming US election without talking about politics, without talking about DC. You have described it as icky in the past. So how engaged do you stay with what's actually happening on Capitol Hill?
Only as much as I have to. I follow it because I think especially the presidential election is really important. I know we always say the most important of our lifetimes. This feels like that label really finally fits with the upcoming election. So I follow it. I try to find ways if I can be useful. I've contributed money to Kamala Harris. And so I follow it as much as I need to. I would love not to follow it at all. And if Harris is elected president, it'll be much easier to do that.
You feel you'll be able to sort of check out a bit, feeling like it's going to be in safe hands in your mind anyway, because you say that you've donated to her campaign, you've endorsed her, you publicly came out and endorsed her, and you said it felt like it's finally, quote, morning in America. What did you mean by those words?
I really feel a sense that something has been uncorked in our country with the stepping aside of President Biden and the emergence of this exciting, charismatic person committed to the rule of law. I think there's an excitement that we haven't felt in this country since 2008. And I think part of the excitement is a hunger that Americans have just to get beyond the nastiness and the name calling and all the horribleness that comes with Donald Trump and his social media. I think people are, maybe not his core, that's not going to change, but most Americans just want to get onto something different. And that's what I meant by saying it finally feels like it's morning in America. And I'm increasingly optimistic about what's going to happen in November.
It will be interesting to see, because we're hearing this narrative, sometimes this pushback against what some people are calling that kind of hate narrative. In the UK, you can probably tell from my accent, I'm British. We've just had the general election there in the summer, and some people were wondering whether the Conservatives would hold on to the government because they were doing that kind of what we call gutter politics, kind of sinking to the low blows. And the opposition, Labour, who eventually came into power with Keir Starmer, always said they were going to take the high ground and not go low like that. But ultimately, they did come in with a few digs. Do you think Harris appointing Waltz as her sort of running mate has helped her kind of get that toughness, but also that approachability, something about not being too removed and too elitist anymore?
I think she's a plenty tough person, given her background. I don't think that's where she needed to shore herself up. I think what she's done by picking Governor Walz is appeal to a broad swath in the middle of this country that often feels overlooked, especially by the Democratic Party. And he's someone who can speak plainly, who can talk about issues in a way that makes people smile, but also resonates. His incantation, mind your own business, really resonates with Americans, especially in the Midwest. And so I think it was a very smart pick. And also, they're both people who are radiating joy and happiness. And that's, Americans, we're complicated people, but at our core, we want to have fun. We want to embrace joy. And I think that's part of what they've tapped into.
In terms of the trajectory of US politics, you've made a very clear statement there already. You do think this actually is a completely pivotal election. Is that because you imagine things turning a certain way if Donald Trump was to regain presidency?
I think if Donald Trump became president again, it would be very bad for all kinds of reasons in the short run. It would also delay the cleansing that we need to get to a place where we have two healthy political parties in the United States. I think with his defeat, which again, I'm optimistic about, the Republican Party will begin what will be a long process of getting to a healthier place and actually representing ideas and proposals and becoming a healthy antagonist for the Democratic Party.
I mean, you talk about that two-horse race, that healthy two-party system, as you just sort of described it. We have had, obviously, independents running in this election, RFK Jr. being one of them, and he actually stopped being an independent in order to endorse Trump. Do you think it will always be a two-party system?
It will. Ours is set up with the way we have a winner-take-all system to drive people to organize their coalitions into two parties. It'll always be that way. We'll have a variety of third-party candidates. As this year, you'll have some wingnuts running as third-party candidates. But in the main, it'll always be two parties. And so we need them both to be active and healthy. And it's okay that they fight about important policy issues, but they have to be committed to the things that really aren't susceptible to partisan division, the rule of law, peaceful transition of power. Those are the things that we're supposed to have as our bedrock, which is why any Republican ought to be voting for the Democrat this time, because there's only one candidate running for election in the United States in November who's committed to a peaceful transition of power and the rule of law, the bedrock of our society.
And hey, look, Mr. Comey, I think it behooves us at this point to remind viewers watching this that you were actually a lifelong Republican. And listening to you saying that, some people might be confused otherwise, but you were up until the point of Donald Trump. Is that correct?
Yeah, I was a registered Republican, and I served in the George W. Bush administration as U.S. attorney and then as the number 2 at the Justice Department. President Obama then asked me to be the FBI director because that's a role that's traditionally outside of politics. But really nobody committed to the things I just mentioned, to the rule of law and to our Constitution, can be a supporter of Donald Trump. And frankly, I don't see how they can be call themselves a Republican these days.
So the grand old party, the GOP, has gone in your mind. Is there a way for it to come back in any way, or is the Republicans now the party of Trump and whoever succeeds him afterwards?
Well, it will have to change because they can't win elections. They can't get above the high watermark of 47% of the American voters supporting them. And so that's not sustainable in the long run to be a minority party. So circumstances will force them to change to get to a healthier place where they can attract the support of a majority of Americans. So that's why in the long run, we'll be okay. We will get to that place, but getting there will be much faster after Donald Trump loses in November.
Well, you say that with some conviction, but at the moment, whilst we're speaking, Harris is only polling just a few points ahead nationwide, and those swing states are still looking like she could lose out to Trump. And obviously those swing states, some say, that is where the election is going to be made. If Trump wins, and you've already touched upon this, you're talking there about law and order and what it means for the country, but what would another Trump presidency look like in your eyes?
I think it would be a bit of a nightmare in a way. I mean, there's a reason that so many members of his own cabinet have not only not endorsed him, but have said this guy should be nowhere near the Oval Office. Donald Trump as president again will be unconstrained in lots of ways, including by not having people around him. He didn't have all-stars the first time. This time he'll have the very bottom of the American barrel, and there are bottom barrel dwellers who would want jobs there. But what the first group did was actually thwart him in a lot of ways, ignore him, cajole him, play him along. The next group around him will not do that. And so all the nutty things, the ideas of shooting protesters in the legs or ordering the prosecution of individuals, those kinds of things that are antithetical to our system, there won't be anybody around Donald Trump to tell him, forget that, or to distract him with a shiny object and then take the memo from his desk. And so you're looking at an administration where he will be able to do the crazy things that so frightened people the first time.
Do you have concerns about another January 6th type event? Probably not replicated, heaven forbid, but in terms of, you know, that type of social media kind of furor, those types of organizations, you know, people organizing and coming together like that again?
I don't. I'm quite worried about individual violence and the epidemic of threats that comes from MAGA world directed at public officials, at the misguided people acting on those threats and individual acts of violence, which are very serious, taking place. I'm not worried about the large-scale January 6th type violence because a message has been sent over the last 4 years with the prosecution of more than 1,000 people for January 6th. The message is your life will be ruined if you engage in that kind of conduct. And the people who would be tempted to are not jihadis looking to lay down their lives for the orange god king. These are people with families, with jobs, with homes, with assets. They don't want to light their lives on fire for Donald Trump. And so that message has been sent. And it's the reason there aren't crowds at any of his court appearances. He's unable to summon that kind of violence because a really important and positive message of deterrence has been sent.
Now, you brought up there his court appearances, of course, multiple ongoing court cases, some civil, some criminal. He is a convicted felon. How do you feel as a former FBI director watching somebody who is a convicted person running for presidency?
If you put it in a book proposal for a crime thriller, your publisher would reject it as fanciful. It's not, come on, come on, someone running for president who's a convicted felon. Well, that's the world in which we live. So it's bizarre. It feels like a dream, but it's a reality. It's going to be a close election when one of the candidates lied about the last election, incited his followers to sack the United States Capitol during the transfer of power, and has subsequently been convicted of multiple felonies. But that's the weird place in which America finds itself. And as I said, I am optimistic that it is morning in America and we're going to put that behind us. But it's very, very important for people who care about things like the rule of law to get out there and participate in this election.
And, you know, in previous months when I've been covering his court cases, I've been interviewing people from the Republican Party and Trump supporters who've talked, of course, about what they call lawfare, which is this idea that the justice system is being weaponized to prevent him from running for president or to put him behind bars. And there was original discussion about that galvanizing his base, making his support more strong. Do you think that theory still holds?
Yes. And it's at the heart of his famous line about, I could shoot someone in the middle of Fifth Avenue and not lose supporters. And the reason for that is just sort of the nature of fraud victims. Is I've done cases where the victims of a fraudster came to his sentencing after he had admitted his guilt to speak on his behalf, because it's very, very hard for people to turn away, to admit what they'd have to admit about themselves when they turn away from a candidate. And if January 6th didn't cause Trump supporters to turn, I don't know what would turn the core group. Human beings just can't take the kind of pain that requires the admission about yourself and how you were fooled and a fool. So it doesn't surprise me that his legal troubles have bound a lot of people more tightly to him. That's just the way humans work.
Will we see him behind bars at any point?
I think there's a real possibility of that. I think there's actually a possibility he's going to get a jail sentence on September the 18th in Manhattan. And when he would serve that and how that will work exactly, they'll have to sort out. But if convicted of the federal offenses, he's going to get a jail sentence unless if President Biden pardons him or future President Harris pardons him. So, yes, I think there's a significant likelihood that he will end up in jail.
It will be extraordinary scenes if we see that. Look, I just want to round off this interview. You've been very generous with your thoughts and your time, but by asking you potentially now more as a writer than in your former role as FBI director, but about information sources and what you trust now when it comes to the sort of public debate, the narrative, obviously social media, there's attacks on mainstream media. What do you look to?
I try to triangulate. That is to get information from a variety of sources and see them collide, because out of the collision of views comes the best view of the truth. It's the magic of a Wikipedia, for example. So many minds coming together gives us a rough approximation of what's true. So I try not to rely just on one news source to give me a picture of the world.
Thank you, Mr. Comey. When's your third book coming out?
Coming out in May, and I'm hard at work on number 4. That's where my head is now.
Excellent. We'll let you get back to your writing desk. James Comey, thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Israel's war on Gaza has killed at least 41,500 Palestinians and wounded at least 96,000, according to the latest figures released on Thursday by the health ministry there. More than half of the dead have been women and children, including about 1,300 babies and toddlers under the age of 2. Israeli forces have repeatedly struck schools, alleging Hamas uses them as command centres to plan attacks. The Palestinian group has denied the charges. Well, my next guest has been a vocal advocate for humanitarian issues, in particular the ongoing crisis in Gaza. As the first Muslim leader of a Western government, Humza Yousaf's personal connection to the region runs deep, with his in-laws previously trapped in Gaza giving him a unique and heartfelt perspective on the conflict. Humza Yousaf, thank you, sir, for your time. Let's begin with the issue at hand, Gaza, because you are deeply connected to this story through your wife, of course, and her family. And I want to begin by asking, how are they?
Well, that's very kind of you to ask. Most of my wife's family have managed to leave Gaza, but unfortunately not all of them. And her cousin, Sally, her 4 children, and her husband, we haven't heard from for, I think, now 5 days. They were in Derbala. Derbala was told to evacuate to a safe zone near Al-Mawasi, and of course there is no such thing as a safe zone in Gaza. We know that from the atrocities that have been committed by the Israeli government thus far. And I'm afraid we don't know where Sally, her 4 children, and her husband are. We pray for their safety. But this is just one story. Of course, there are millions of people, and therefore millions of families across the world worried about their loved ones in Gaza. And I think even if you don't have a human connection in the way that I do, and a family connection in the way that my wife and I do, then still people are rightly angered, upset at the scale of the atrocity that we see the people of Gaza are suffering from.
Now, you've clearly used your platform as a major working politician and as the former First Minister of Scotland over previous months to talk about Gaza, to talk about what is happening there for Palestinian people. But you've also come under criticism from some saying, in their opinion, that you're failing to be, you're too partisan because you're too closely connected to the issue. What is your response to that?
Well, my response is pretty simple, that it's really clear that this is an issue of international law. You don't have to be pro-Palestinian or pro-Israeli, you just have to be pro-international law. To say that unequivocally, as I did, that there was no justification for the terrible crimes that were committed on October the 7th, and at the same time, nothing, of course, can justify killing innocent Gazans, innocent children, innocent men and innocent women, collectively punishing them. 40,000, we know now, Gazans have been killed, not died, have been killed by the Israeli government. So I'm a believer in the equitable and equal application of international law. And that must apply, of course, to state parties and non-state parties equally. And we have, with Israel, a Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, where there is an arrest warrant from the ICC being sought. So therefore, in my opinion, we should be treating those who are breaching international law in an equal manner, whether they are a terrorist organisation or whether they are the head of a government.
Look, I'm glad you brought up the ICC because there are reports that your wife's family is preparing evidence from their time spent trapped in Gaza to present to the ICC. Is that still going ahead, and what outcome do you hope for?
Yes, I mean, the ICC themselves, the prosecutors involved, have been asking those with eyewitness testimony to come forward. And just to give you an example of some of the eyewitness testimony from my mother-in-law, they were in their house in Derbala in Gaza. This was in late October, and the blast occurred. And when the dust literally settled on that blast, they went outside, and there was an 8-year-old girl lying in their front garden who had broken her spine. She had been lifted in the air many metres high and landed in their front garden with, as I say, a broken spine, completely paralysed. That's just one example of the many things that my mother-in-law and father-in-law saw, and therefore it's right that we compile that testimony, collate it, and present it to the International Criminal Court. And it is for the International Criminal Court, the judges, to decide whether an arrest warrant should be granted or not. But I hope every single person, as I say, state or non-state party, that commits egregious breaches of international law must be held to account. Otherwise, international law is completely and utterly meaningless.
How much hope do you have for that international law, the process being followed through then, and Netanyahu being held to account for those crimes that you're talking about?
Look, I have to believe, and I can understand why people don't believe that international law is applied equally. Let's be frank here. It seems from the international community's response to Gaza that Palestinian lives are cheaper, that Palestinian blood is cheap. That is the view from many people, not just Muslims, not just those in the East, but many people believe that to be the case, given how we deal with, for example, egregious breaches of international law in Ukraine, and I fully support the people in the government of Ukraine, versus how we deal with egregious breaches of international law in Gaza. There is a double standard, a hypocrisy, which is very evident for many people to see. So international law has to mean something, and therefore, if there is an ICC arrest warrant granted by the judges of the International Criminal Court, then it must be upheld. That means if the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, does land in UK soil, then it's important that he is immediately arrested.
Now, look, in terms of the way forward from here, and I know it's early for some to even begin thinking of that, but certainly among countries and governments in the Middle East, there's been more activity in recent weeks and months to try and find some sort of sustainable solution between Israel and Palestine. What to you does sustainable coexistence look like?
Well, it's a good question. So there is the immediate, and in the immediate, there must, of course, be a ceasefire. We need that ceasefire so that, of course, the remaining hostages are released, and, of course, then the humanitarian aid gets completed and unfettered access into Gaza, and the violence and the massacre and the killing of innocent Gazan people stops immediately. So that's why, in the immediate term, we need that ceasefire. In the more longer term, in terms of a sustainable future, I want to see a two-state solution. I'm a believer in the two-state solution, a viable, safe, secure Palestinian state alongside a safe, secure Israel. That is what the two-state solution must deliver. But the hypocrisy from many governments, including, I'm afraid, the United Kingdom government, is that they recognise one state, so they recognise the state of Israel, but they refuse to recognise the state of Palestine. That's unjustifiable. That is hypocritical. That, to me, does not show somebody who's honest, or a government that's honest, about trying to find a long-term sustainable solution. So if you believe in a two-state solution, if you believe in peace in that region, then you must immediately recognise the state of Palestine, as Ireland, Norway and Spain have done so recently.
The two words keep cropping up in our conversation, one being hypocrisy and the other being hope. Hypocrisy, in your mind, seems to be winning out a little bit in terms of the way things are sorted out. But what about hope then? Do you think there is any hope for that two-state solution within the next few years?
I do. I actually think this is probably a critical turning point. I think many people across the world, many who understandably did not know much about the terrible atrocities happening under occupation for the people of Palestine, have now woken up. They've seen the horrific images that we've all witnessed over the last 10 months. So I do think this is a critical juncture. I think this is a turning point. And I think there is inevitability about the recognition, global recognition of the Palestinian state, but it has to be immediate. The world has promised now for many decades that there will be an equal Palestinian state coexisting alongside the state of Israel. They have turned their back on that promise for far too many decades, but I believe it's now only a matter of time until there is that global recognition of the Palestinian state. And I'm talking to you, of course, from Scotland in the United Kingdom, and the United Kingdom government must stop wasting any more time and must immediately recognise the state of Palestine. To do otherwise, as I say, is hypocrisy, or paying lip service, and merely lip service, to your support of a two-state solution.
What do you make of the UK government's policy towards this conflict so far? Of course, we had a change of government in the UK over the summer, but do you think they're making the right decisions when it comes to this conflict?
So the previous Conservative government was, I'm afraid, complicit in my mind, because not only did they give almost unequivocal backing to the government of Israel, regardless of what atrocities were committed, but of course the UK government was sending arms and continues to send arms to Israel. So when it comes to the current United Kingdom government, the new government, the Labour government that is now in charge, there have been some stronger statements in regards to the situation in Gaza, but there's two issues that remain unresolved. One is the UK government continues to sell arms. There has to be a complete ban, a complete suspension of arms sales to Israel. There's talk of a partial suspension. There must be a complete suspension of arms sales to Israel. And the second issue, as we've already discussed, must be the immediate recognition of the state of Palestine. There's no need to wait for some mythical process that might exist in the future. If you already recognise the state of Israel, you must complete the other side of the equation and recognise the state of Palestine, as our neighbours in Ireland have done, our neighbours in Spain, our neighbours in Norway have done.
It is something to note exactly that those countries surrounding the UK have made that decision. The UK still holding out. Look, UK not the only one having an election in this historic election year. The US, of course, holding an election in November. We don't know, of course, who's going to be in the White House. Could it be Harris? Could it be Trump? But what do you think that could mean for the situation in Gaza?
Well, again, I think it's actually the American people that will drive forward change in the United States. I was heartwarmed, I have to say, to see many, many months ago now, when American Jews were the ones who occupied Central Station in New York demanding a ceasefire. It was the American Jewish community that occupied Congress and demanded a ceasefire. So it is the people of the United States who undoubtedly will be the conscience for their government. They will be the ones who I hope will drive that change. And the United States, of course, one of, if not arguably, the most powerful geopolitical player in the globe. I think it's really important that they uphold international law. When we saw the interventions from the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, I was aghast when you had members of Congress threatening to sanction the International Criminal Court. Look, the international law has to mean something, and therefore it has to be applied equally and equitably. We can't pick and choose who international law applies to and who it doesn't apply to. So I would urge whoever is the next president of the United States, and that will clearly be a matter for the American people, to make sure that when it comes to its geopolitical stance, that it's driven by humanity, by compassion, and by the upholding of international law.
Now, you already mentioned Ukraine as part of the discussion, and you have said recently you want support for Ukraine to remain steadfast from the United Kingdom, I'm assuming, but also from the US, from the Western Allied forces. But what do you make then of Ukraine's recent push into Russia? How has this changed things?
Well, for me, there is a Russian war of aggression that has been waged against the people and the government of Ukraine. And for me, the situation is pretty simple. The people of Ukraine are also fighting for Europe's freedom and for our freedom. I've met many Ukrainian families here in Scotland forced to leave their home due to that war of aggression from the Russians. And of course, the Ukrainians have every right to defend themselves and to fight back. Let's make no mistake about it, it is Vladimir Putin that has waged this war of aggression, as he did, of course, many years ago when annexing Crimea. So I make no apology about my stances at all. I always look at these issues through the lens of international law, as I've said to you already, and there's no justification, none, for Vladimir Putin waging this war of aggression. So we need Vladimir Putin to be held to account for that, for the annexation of land and for the war that he's waged in Ukraine.
Indeed, Mr. Yousaf, you've made no apologies throughout your career, in fact, for voicing your strong policy positions, your opinions, not only within the government, but also on social media. So I hope that while we've got you for this discussion, you don't mind us touching on this topic, because it brought you to even bigger acclaim recently when you ended up in this online spat with the world's richest man, tech billionaire Elon Musk, who branded you, and I know you're aware of this, a super racist in his words, quote, and that you loathe white people. You, in response, called him a dangerous race baiter. Did you ever think you'd end up in that position?
Well, actually, it's not the first time I've challenged wealthy billionaires, and I'll make it very clear to Elon Musk that his billions will never buy me off. He'll never be able to silence me, and for calling out what his support for white supremacy. And that had devastating consequences here in the United Kingdom. Let's rewind back a few weeks when that tragic killing in Southport took place. It was a tragic killing of 3 beautiful souls that took place, and immediately in the aftermath of that devastating attack, there was disinformation and misinformation being spread that the individual involved was a Muslim, was a migrant. Of course, it turned out neither of those things was true. But that disinformation was amplified, not just in social media, but the disinformation amplified in the days after that by Elon Musk himself. Now, he is, in my view, a sympathiser of not just the far right, but of white supremacy. And if he thinks with his billions he can get me to be quiet, or he can shut me up, he can think again.
Well, he did, in fact, say these words to his some nearly 200 million followers. Did that make you consider legal recourse, some kind of official reprimand? Would you do that?
Well, look, there's always the legal avenue that's open to us, but I've always said, from my perspective, I'm happy to debate and challenge Elon Musk. Perhaps you can moderate that debate. I'm more than happy to debate him anytime, any place, anywhere. Like him, I believe in free speech, but free speech is not absolute. It has its limits, and you cannot incite violence in the way that Elon Musk has and not expect there to be any consequences. And let's be frank about it, and research has been done into this since Elon Musk took over Twitter, now of course X. It has had a proliferation of right-wing, far-right accounts unleashed upon it, and that has, as I say, very dangerous consequences indeed.
And that, of course, has been an even bigger topic with the recent arrest of Pavel Durov, the head of Telegram in France, and, you know, European governments trying to work out their approach to law and free speech as well. So do you think governments should have a role in regulating social media?
They must. They absolutely must. Look, I'm an advocate of free speech, but free speech is, as I say, not absolute. We cannot go into a packed theatre and shout fire, and therefore the panic that ensues thereafter, people could get killed. Nobody advocates for absolute no limits whatsoever on free speech. There must be an element of regulation on social media, and my challenge to the United Kingdom government is that they must take firmer steps to punish those who incite violence and racism on social media platforms. And by the way, I get it every single day, frankly. I get abusive messages, racist messages, Islamophobic messages, death threats towards me and my family on various social media platforms, but primarily on X. So there has to be some level of regulation. The current levels are simply not good enough.
Now let's just finish up by talking about leaving, or whether you remain in that fight, because you've talked in the past about potentially leaving the United Kingdom. Is that true? Is that something that you would consider?
Look, I don't want to leave Scotland. Scotland is my home. I was born here, raised here, raising my beautiful 3 girls here. I wouldn't want to leave Scotland, but the truth of the matter is, particularly since the race riots that took place in the United Kingdom, and there wasn't any in Scotland, but the ones that took place across other parts of the United Kingdom, has meant that every single Muslim that I know and that I've spoken to, and this applies to me, is wondering, will my children be safe here in the future? My children are beautiful mixed-race children of Scottish, Palestinian, Pakistani heritage. Can I say truthfully that in the future they're going about their business, walking the streets, going to a friend's house, going to the mosque, for example, that they will be safe from attack or from reprisal? I can't truthfully say that with any certainty, and that's why so many of us, in fact every single Muslim I think, is virtually questioning whether or not they have a safe future here in the United Kingdom or not.
And it's a hard thing to draw parallels between feelings of safety or the reality of safety in the real world and that of online. But there is some sort of parallel to be drawn with remaining or leaving X, formerly Twitter, as well, because you've ended up in a situation, you say you receive abuse daily. Plenty of politicians in the UK have considered or have indeed left X in recent weeks and months, organisations, journalists, because they feel they can't responsibly be there anymore. Again, do you think it's more responsible to leave or to remain and try and change things?
Look, I can see the arguments both ways, I have to say, but look, I was on X for many, many years before Elon Musk took it over when it was Twitter. Don't get me wrong, I think it's always had some significant challenges with those who harass and abuse people. But I frankly think Elon Musk should be the one that should leave it, given that he's turned it into an absolute vile cesspit. And at the same time, if everybody who leaves it that is progressive, that is making the argument for common humanity, then of course it's just left to those who will peddle far-right conspiracy theories and white supremacy, and I don't think that's a very healthy platform. So I can completely understand the argument, but look, I'll stay on X and I'll keep challenging Elon Musk. As I say, his billions definitely can't force me off that platform and can't shut me up.
So for now, we'll continue to see you there on X, and we'll continue to see you there in Scotland and in the UK. Look, Humza Yousaf, it's been a pleasure speaking. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thank you.
The conflict with Hezbollah has seen hundreds killed and more than 1,500 people injured since Israel launched its initial attacks on September 7th. But what is the history behind these tensions between Hezbollah and Israel, and how can peace be reached in the Middle East? Well, for more, I'm joined by the former UK Member of Parliament who has twice held ministerial positions in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, as Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State from 2010 to 2013 and as Minister of State for the Middle East from 2017 to 2019, Alistair Burt. Mr. Burt, good of you to make time for us. And given your wealth of experience of the region, what has it been like there in the UK watching events unfold in the Middle East, not only over the course of the last year, but certainly in the last fortnight with the ratcheting up in tensions?
Well, thank you, Rosanna, for asking. It's been very despairing. Those of us who have spent some time on this over the years know that you could have asked your question about the events of last week, last year, the events of the last 10 years, the events of the last 30 years. The despairing thing is that it just goes on. I think in reaction to very recent events, I'd say two things. Firstly, the polarization in the United Kingdom is as great as I can recall it, in that it is very difficult for people to express empathy for all victims, expressing empathy for those who were caught up in the atrocity of October the 7th, the attack by Hamas, and expressing sympathy for the victims of the reprisals in Gaza and now Lebanon is very difficult, because you're almost forced to take one side or the other. To express empathy for one is to be assumed to be supporting them against the other. So there's that sense of polarization, which is much greater. I think, secondly, the events of the last week have heightened the tension in relation to Lebanon. We know it was always the intention of some in Israel to pursue Hezbollah in the same way as Hamas because of the threat posed to Israel. And the rhetoric from Prime Minister Netanyahu at the UN and the actions of Israel in the last couple of weeks would suggest that Israel has taken a decision that it is time to tackle Hezbollah and seek a military victory instead of the diplomatic relationship and end of the conflict that so many others are urging upon all sides in the region.
Indeed, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressing the UN General Assembly on Friday and saying that his country, Israel, is seeking peace, that he wasn't even considering attending UNGA because of the state of his country being at war, but saying he needed to set the record straight against the, quote, slander and lies that he believes that Israel has faced over the course of the last year. In terms of that message getting through, him feeling like he has successfully set the record straight regards Israel, do you think people will be sympathetic to that, given that some people actually began walking out during the start of his address?
No, I don't think he'll be successful in that because, as I said earlier, this is a completely polarized situation. Those who do not want to listen to Israel and its explanation as what has happened over the past year will not listen. Those who believe that only Israel is telling the truth will not need to be further convinced. But it's landing nowhere in terms of those who want to understand the background to the situation and whether or not there is any way forward. All people see is these two sides deeply polarized with no opportunity to talk in the middle. And that's very worrying because you always need a place to begin to talk to sides involved in a conflict to see if there's any way in which the conflict can be brought to an end without further confrontation. In my experience in the region over the years, very little has been solved by military activity. Look at Iraq, look at Syria, the continuing war in Yemen. Nothing gets resolved if it's purely military because the problems remain. So Prime Minister Netanyahu's statement of belief about Israel, and as he said, putting his side's case, will largely have fallen on deaf ears because those who have listened were already convinced, and those who walked out and those who stayed but don't believe him will not be convinced.
And look, Israel saying before they began, during their military action over Lebanon over the past week, that they waited for diplomatic solutions, that they've tried. But obviously there has been cross-border fire between Hezbollah and Israel over the course of the last year that just hasn't stopped. So they felt like military action was the only solution at this point. Can you understand it?
Yes, I can. These issues go back a long time. Fundamentally, about in Hezbollah's case, their absolute refusal to accept the existence of the state of Israel because of the way in which Hezbollah came together, and their belief that it is their mission to seek to destroy Israel. Israel was shaken beyond all understanding by the events of October the 7th and the attack by Hamas. It's completely traumatized the state. It's changed. October the 7th has changed everything in the region, and the determination of Israel to prevent Hezbollah mounting a similar attack in northern Israel has led to the evacuation of that land. And this is seen by Israel as a national insult. Why should its people be forced to live elsewhere? That is how it sees it. Hence the determination to take action, which I think has now reached a critical point.
What about the proportionality of the response? I know we've discussed it a lot over the last year, since October 7th, that Israel has a right to defend itself, but the proportionality has moved the dial too far in the other direction. The volume of civilian casualties and injuries that we've witnessed in Gaza, the conflict that we're now seeing happening in Lebanon as well. Do you think Israel still has a sense of proportionality?
I don't, because we take a fundamentally different view on this. Israel believes that that anything is legitimate in pursuit of those who commit terror against it and those that it accuses of genocide against the Jewish people. And it said very clearly, if it targets terrorists and they are surrounded by others, by innocent civilians, they will blame the terrorists for surrounding themselves with those civilians, but Israel will strike. Now, to many of the rest of us, the numbers of those killed in Gaza, and estimates, as you are aware, Rosanna, go way beyond the 40,000 that's been already reported. There could be at least double that. Who knows how many are under the rubble? To many others, this seems disproportionate. Above all, in the Arab world, it seems disproportionate. What has happened is Hamas has succeeded out of its atrocity in gaining the sympathy of those who wish to see resistance to Israel. And Israel, having suffered this appalling moral blow against it, is now seen as the perpetrator of criminality in the way in which it has executed its reprisals. This is an extraordinary situation, but it just demonstrates there is no success here. There is no victory for anyone, and the numbers of those killed, the generational impact this will have. Because for the orphans there, maybe 15, 17,000, the tradition has been in over the past decades, those orphans will likely be looked after either by Hamas or Hezbollah or those who will fund them. And what will they do when they grow up? Unless there is a diplomatic solution to this, which involves all the states in the region, including the Arab states, which have reached out to each other, to Israel and to Iran in recent times to try and find a different Middle East. Unless that succeeds, then these conflicts will be endless and they will be worse.
I want to come back to progress or lack of in terms of diplomatic solution, but just talk for a moment about, I think, something that you touched on there we can talk about a bit more is the information warfare side of this and the perceptions of both Hamas in Gaza but also Israel over the last year and how that's been shifted by accusations of slander, as we've already discussed, polarization you've mentioned, but also just sheer discrediting of facts. I spoke to a Deputy National Security Advisor for Israel recently who said that claims of starvation in Gaza of late have been fabricated. It's not true. The military action on the ground by Israel hasn't been that intense. It's just not as horrible as the media and various voices are making out. And on the other side of things, you hear other types of discrediting information against Israel, and Israel saying, look, we've become a victim in all of this as well in terms of public perception. How fair do you think it is of people to basically say that Israel has become a cruel fighter in all of this?
It's almost impossible to disentangle. Israel is hampered by the fact that it has not allowed independent media into Gaza. So the information that's come out of Gaza is either from it itself or from Palestinian embedded journalists who've lived in Gaza, or indeed the figures we've seen from the health ministry, which is run by the Hamas authorities. So Israel has hampered itself in trying to let anybody see exactly what goes on. Secondly, we do live in a world of disinformation. It began right at the beginning. If you remember, there was an explosion at a hospital fairly shortly after Israel began its efforts against Hamas. This was immediately blamed on Israel, that it had deliberately targeted this hospital. It turns out that most experts believe this wasn't the case. It was a misfired rocket by Hamas. Nonetheless, the story was already out there. Those involved in the conflict have no interest in delivering the truth, so they will inevitably colour all incidents one way or another. What we do know is shocking enough. We know that Hamas executed recently 6 hostages in a tunnel, causing no risk to any of their captors, but they were cruelly murdered. We know that thousands of women and children have been killed in bombing raids in Gaza. We already know all this. We know that the pagers that went off in Lebanon were so primed that they required someone to pick them out of their pocket and look at them before they exploded. These are horrific incidents. And to try and create a situation where you will get people to live in peace with each other after these events have occurred, and there are worse, is very difficult. And the disinformation is part of it. I think, honestly, it is very hard to disentangle. I think there has been wrong and evil on both sides. And I don't think it's unfair both to condemn the atrocity of October the 7th by Hamas and also condemn the nature of the reprisals that Israel has taken.
And look, the polarisation that you touched on before, I think, is very interesting when we consider the effect it has on the way people perceive foreign powers, but also their own governments. You and I are both from the United Kingdom, where there was a general election earlier this summer, and Gaza actually played a big role in the election campaign and the way people were thinking and voting. We saw candidates having to remove themselves from the race because of it. Ultimately, of course, the election wasn't probably decided on the Middle East, but it had an impact. So regarding the US election that's upcoming, how big an impact do you think what's happening in the Middle East is it going to have on whether people decide to vote for Trump or Harris on voting day?
Good question, Rosanna. In the United Kingdom, there was a limited impact, but a significant one. 5 seats that the Labour Party, the governing party now, that would have expected to win in that general election were in fact won by independents, and independents standing in largely Muslim areas on a platform supporting what was the actions of those who were resisting Israel in Gaza, and very volubly. In the United States, where Gaza and this conflict will not decide the whole election, the issue will be in marginal states. But we all understand the American process means that maybe 5 states, and within those 5 states, maybe a few 100,000 votes within those states will determine the election. Now, when you look at the Arab American population in some areas, the Jewish population in others, then clearly there will be an impact. And people are assuming that that the Democrats may suffer from Arab Americans not supporting Kamala Harris because of the United States' position, Joe Biden's position on Gaza. So it could be significant.
And I hope you don't mind me asking, because I know obviously, you might not want to take a position on this, but in terms of who does enter the White House, do you think it will be better for Middle East tensions and geopolitics at large, whether it is Harris or Trump in there?
Well, you're quite right. I'm hesitant as a UK, even a UK former politician to get into this area. In that the United Kingdom will work with whoever wins. And there are different voices in the Middle East. To answer your question directly, I know some in the Middle East who believe that the Democrats' support for the region since the time of President Obama has been very mixed. They look at the decision in relation to Syria, the red line that was supposed not to be crossed in terms of chemical attack by President Assad. When it was, there was no action from the United States. There was no action from the United States when the Houthi missiles hit Aramco in Saudi Arabia and the airports in the UAE. And there have been question marks about the United States position for some time. There are those who believe that President Trump's particular style and the fact that it's so uncertain what he might do would actually require others to consider very carefully what their actions would be. There are others who believe that his unstinting support for Israel and his determination to pull the United States out of the nuclear deal with Iran, which limited Iran's nuclear process, the pulling out of which I regard as disastrous, encouraged by Prime Minister Netanyahu, means that his actions in relation to that could be considered more hazardous to the region. It's an open question. I'm not sure anyone outside America has got a point of view that's more valid than the electorate in America. They will decide these things, but either candidate will face a difficult situation in the Middle East and not the easiest of legacies of the United States up to now.
Look, that's a fair response to a question of international diplomacy there between the UK and the US. But in terms of the role that the UK does indeed play on the global stage, you know, we've been hearing the same lines out of the UK government from last week that you would expect when you have a flare-up in tensions, which is urging for restraint, de-escalation, not in anyone's interest, etc. Does it actually make a difference?
It makes a difference, the United Kingdom acting in accordance with others. Does it make a difference in what the United Kingdom thinks on its own? No, broadly it doesn't. We're not the greatest influence in the region. But when we have a voice with the dozen others or so who signed the statement the other day, the United States, France, Germany, when the United Kingdom is acting in concert with its former European partners in the European Union, that makes a difference. And that's important so that people know where the United Kingdom stands. We still have effective resources in the area. People will recall that in April, when Iran launched a missile barrage against Israel, United Kingdom forces were deployed to help defend Israel against those missiles. So we're still a force in the area. But more than anything, we're a diplomatic force. And I've long argued since the start of the conflict, or the most recent element of this conflict from last October, that the United Kingdom could play a stronger convening role. We all know that this won't be settled unless there is a comprehensive solution to the issues involving the Palestinian people. We've heard just in the last few days, Saudi Arabia has made it very clear there is no normalization with Israel unless there is a Palestinian state. No mincing of words there. And in order to get there, there's got to be a consideration of the occupation on the West Bank, which has to come to an end, the situation in East Jerusalem, as well as Gaza, and a resolution in relation to Lebanon. This can only be done by diplomacy, and the United Kingdom can play a key part in bringing together those who must want to see an end to this. And the other question will be Iran. What the future Iran sees both for itself and the region. A situation in which there is continuing conflict which is laid at its door because of its support of various proxy groups. That is not a good recipe for peace in the future either.
I'm glad you brought the conversation back to diplomatic solutions for what's currently happening, because you wrote an article recently that caught our eye about how something positive could emerge from the Israel-Hamas war. Could you expand on that for our viewers?
Yes, I said it seemed incongruous to suggest that anything good can come out of it, but I took the view that everything has changed since October the 7th. There is no going back ever to October the 6th, which was a false status quo. Israel believed the issue of the Palestinian people could be managed. That view was shared by a number of states in the region who believed that they could make a relationship with Israel more formal than it had been without the Palestinian issue being settled. And that is now comprehensively not the case. And as well as the situation in Gaza, as I indicated a moment ago, there is no resolution of Gaza without a resolution in relation to the West Bank and East Jerusalem. No one is going to rebuild Gaza and put significant amounts of money into it if it's going to be bombed to bits again in 3 years' time. And my other reason for hope was that in the couple of years leading up to October the 7th, there were great efforts being made in the Middle East to end regional rivalries. Iran was talking to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. friends were talking in a way they hadn't done before. There was this process of believing that Israel could be brought into the economy of the region to the benefit of all. Saudi Arabia has its Vision 2030. Most of the Gulf states have their visions. None of this can be delivered if there is to be a conflict. Accordingly, everything suggests that the conflict has to come to an end. There has to be a comprehensive settlement. And just maybe the events of October the 7th and subsequent are so dreadful, and with the possibility of war in Lebanon increasing, when this ends, it's got to end once and for all. And there's got to be an opportunity taken for the comprehensive agreement that so many people believe must happen.
And assuming that you are still a supporter of a two-state solution for Israel and Palestine, do you feel that we're some way closer to that at the moment, or further, given the expanse of your career and what you've seen?
Rosanna, I think you could have a handful of guests on and we'd probably all say something different. The short answer to your question is, I don't know. I do believe at the moment the level of trust between peoples who are living in proximity to each other is such that imagining people actually living next door to each other without some form of secure border or defense between them seems very difficult. The degree of trust that was lost by the attack on October the 7th throughout Israel was enormous, and that trauma has not been repaired. Equally, when you see what is happening in Gaza, the idea that people could all live together in one state seems to me very difficult. Having said that, I've heard growing, particularly Palestinian voices saying, no, two-state is not right, it must be one state, in which the Jewish people are free to live, but it's not necessarily a Jewish state. It's a state for all of us who have claims to the land. Now, trying to disentangle that, I don't know. Ultimately, I think where people outside should work towards is self-determination for the Palestinian people. Eventually, people in the region, they've got to decide for themselves what it is they want to have as their form of governance. It's no longer going to be decided by some great conference in Vienna or Paris or London or New York. This will be decided regionally. The region is very different to how it was in 67 or 2006 or other significant years. The region will make decisions here. And the Palestinian people and self-determination, I think, is an important part of it. But what the end state of governance will be, I'm not sure at the moment anyone can say. But if it's not going to be two-state, I'd need some convincing about how a one-state solution would work.
Former UK Member of Parliament, former Minister of State for the Middle East, Alistair Burt, it's been great having your time and your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you for watching, and be sure to join us tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.
Hong Kong. Situated in the eastern region of China's Pearl River is Hong Kong. Its name roughly translates to fragrant harbor, as the city's natural geographic features make it an ideal water port. Hong Kong greatly embodies the Chinese concept of yin and yang, a balance of contrasting features. It's a modern city with a beautiful skyline, but at the same time, Hong Kong's roots are deeply rooted in rich Chinese and Buddhist cultures. Go urban and visit the cityscape for the biggest shopping malls and the best in modern architecture that the city has to offer, or take it slow by visiting the many age-old Buddhist and Confucian temples around Hong Kong. Because of its British colonial history, Hong Kong is also a veritable melting pot of East meets West cultures in Asia. You'll see that this is especially evident in the contrasting architectural marvels around the city. Hong Kong is considered as one of the international hubs in the region and is home to the biggest international companies operating in Asia. Hong Kong is also a food lover's paradise. Whether it's big fancy dining like Hong Kong's award-winning Tim Ho Wan, or just your hole-in-the-wall food stop, there's bound to be something for you. Of course, no visit is ever complete without some must-see destinations. If you're going to Hong Kong, don't forget to check out the Tan Tian Buddha, a giant 112-foot bronze statue depicting Buddha, which is located in Hong Kong's Lantau Island. The Star Ferry Harbor Tour, a short 11-minute ferry across the Hong Kong harbor. Tickets are cheap and the ferry schedule is set throughout the day. It's a great way to catch a glimpse of the Hong Kong skyline. For those eager for the Hong Kong nightlife scene, Lan Kwai Fong is a place to be. Boasting of over 90 establishments catering to food and entertainment, Lan Kwai Fong is also known to attract local and foreign celebrities. And of course, let's not forget shopping. Hong Kong's famous Temple Street Night Market is a bargain hunter's dream. Everything from fashion, electronics, toys, and souvenirs are here.
My next guest was a senior U.S. intelligence officer specializing in counterterrorism and code breaking. Malcolm Nance has studied and written about the goals of Vladimir Putin and the Russian intelligence network's effort to sow disinformation. And he recently served with the Ukrainian Foreign Legion, a group of international fighters supporting Ukrainian resistance to the Russian invasion. Malcolm Nance, thank you very much for your time. I want to start by asking you, what has the U.S. Department of Justice said about this particular operation with the Russian bot farm?
Well, for the most part, this is one of many different types of influence operations that have been carried out for over the last 8 years. It's just that now we've been able to determine and identify one specific one that was done with the assistance of law enforcement, and now that the Department of Justice can actually take action against. 99% of the time, we never find these farms. They work through a lot of cutouts. They work through a series of servers and the dark web. It's very unique that we, in fact, got to the point where you could actually make an indictment and come out against the people who could be identified enough to shut them down.
That's interesting you say that, because there are obviously reports and a certain degree of speculation too, but who, in your opinion, would be involved in setting up such a plan, and who would sign off on it? Would President Putin be aware for sure?
Well, you know, I've been tracking this for over 9 years now. Russia's influence operations started back in the early 2000s with a document called the Gerasimov Doctrine, who was the commander of the Russian armed forces. And the Gerasimov Doctrine was to create an influence operation on such a massive scale that they could actually tilt the opinions of foreign populations. Vladimir Putin, ex-KGB officer, intelligence officer, signed off on this long ago. And what we called very early on the first web war, when Russia started carrying out operations against the nation state of Georgia, Estonia, Latvia, moved on to influencing elections in Ukraine and other places through these bot farms, really took off in 2015 with the attack on, the hacking of the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the United States, and then militarizing it by giving most of their operations to the Russian military intelligence, the GRU, and their special activities units, and then allowing Yevgeny Prigozhin to carry out a civilian activity known as the Internet Research Agency. this is an integral part of Russia's soft power now. And it appears to be successful in many places.
I was going to say, apart from what is considered state-sponsored interference, how likely is it that individuals could act independently of any Russian government involvement? How often is that an issue? Is it something that would even be encouraged, perhaps, by the government?
Well, it's always encouraged by them. In fact, the first web war, as we called it, started out with a situation that occurred in Estonia, where they removed a Russian military statue. As you know, that was a former occupied state from the Soviet Union, which had many Soviet statues there. When they removed that statue, individual actors in the Russian, cyber world started attacking Estonia. And this is where the Russian intelligence and diplomatic apparatus saw that they could harness the power of individuals, organize it, and turn it into a dagger, or more importantly, a tool to hack the mindset of a foreign population. So this has been going on for some time. Interestingly, it hasn't been as successful for Ukraine as it's been for the United States government, or when they tried to influence Brexit, the Scottish referendum, the referendum on Catalonia in Spain.
Now, of course, there is the application within Russia itself, where people can be given some degree of confidence in their leader because of the information that's out there. It's used to kind of shape society. But I wonder, what would Russia at a government level hope to achieve by interfering with US elections?
Well, they've already done it. And this is a component of the Gerasimov doctrine. And if your watchers want to learn more about it, there's a document on the internet called the NATO Handbook on Russian influence operations. It's essentially how Russia attacks nations, changes the media environment, changes the information globosphere, so to speak, where you get information, then seeds it with disinformation, misinformation, lies, and allows individual players within those societies to pick up their disinformation, run with it, and then influence it. When Russia hacked the Democratic National Committee in 2015 and 2016, they did exactly what happened to what Richard Nixon ordered with Watergate. They got dirt, they got information, and even if the information was benign, by stealing it, they could seed it with whatever they wanted. And they seeded the information sphere, so to speak, with the false accusation that they had 30,000 of Hillary Clinton's private internal emails. They didn't. But the conspiratorial information space believed it, and believed it right to the point that it came out of Donald Trump's mouth. Russia assisted the Trump campaign directly and indirectly and through information operations to make this conspiratorial tone against Hillary Clinton and got him elected. And that's what they really want, power and influence by corrupting our elections.
Now, of course, social media has really had a big impact on how the information can be spread. How easily do you think people in the USA would be influenced by disinformation created in Russian bot farms?
9 years ago, I would have said it was very difficult, we're thoughtful, but now the information space has changed dramatically. And, I hesitate to use the word information space. It is actually a domain of information battlesphere, right? This is where there literally is a fight. We're using information to technically hack the mindset or the beliefs of your society. Look, the United States is very vulnerable. We have already seen with the rise of the MAGA sphere, right, the Make America Great campaign by Donald Trump. They believe any conspiracy that's put out there so long as it comes out of the mouth of Donald Trump. It is then captured and magnified by the Russian disinformation machine. Now we see China has been playing this game as well, not to mention their own people will disseminate anything. And this creates a giant avalanche of false information that no individual can check. And even if you try to use a governmental organization like, the National the National Cyber Infrastructure Agency, you can't. Laws allow freedom of speech. So speech has been weaponized, and lies themselves can become, on the ground facts. They're Googleable. So this is the danger, because fundamental documents like the Constitution of the United States or the Bill of Rights, if you get enough lies out there giving a false interpretation, you can change the mindset of, let's count by now, 74 million people that believe that the 2020 election was stolen. That's just a lie. But they believe it.
Your experience, when it comes back to these bot farms and the disinformation that is really being pumped out there, how successful is the US in defending against such attacks?
Yeah, we're very poor. Let's just be frank. The very vehicles that make America the country that it is, right? This bastion of freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of sharing of information, freedom of religion. All of these are fundamental building blocks that our adversaries have seen could be weaponized against us. And that's why you have Russia jumping in on freedom of speech through these bot farms. Same with China. And if you've never seen a bot farm, just Google the phrase bot farm. And what you'll see banks and banks and banks of hundreds of telephones that have all been connected together to one central keyboard or one central telephone, and they're all fake profiles, thousands upon thousands of fake profiles, and they will put out the exact same words, or an AI will put out a variation of those words, right. And then it will look like some individual, and that you're being influenced by individual people who are all of a like mind, when in fact you are being influenced by a foreign intelligence agency, or you're being influenced by a foreign disinformation operation in order to hack your mindset and tell you what you think the crowd is doing and hope that you go along with it. But the United States is not very good at that because our very laws protect those speeches, even if they're from a Chinese bot farm.
Let's tap into what you've just said about AI, because that can vary the message. In the old days, of course, it was far more obvious. It was all coming, the same kind of message was going out. So from what you've experienced over these years, AI has become a much bigger player. How has AI changed the game for those wanting to cause chaos or influence opinion among the American electorate?
Good, excellent question. It's dramatically changed the game. You have to understand that AI AI is just an automated process to make things that we do routinely go faster. So like when you make that phone call and you want to pay a bill and it's asking you a series of obviously stated questions, it's just now in text, it's so good, you can virtually not tell it apart from another person unless you see the idiosyncrasies of speech or see some of the characteristics that show that you're speaking to AI. Many circumstances, you may think you're talking to an actual human or receiving a message from a human, but it is as fast as a billionth of a second. That's how fast it can send a message. So if you want to send out 1 billion phone messages, if you have access to the telephones, you have access to the ability to make that kind of communication, you can influence multiple systems in less than enough time that it takes to write your message and stroke a keyboard. That has far greater depth than news media, far greater depth than Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. A really quick example of it. TikTok put out a video, allowed a series of videos for a few days last year in the October 7th era, where American citizens claimed that they were influenced by Osama bin Laden's letter to America and justifying the mass murder of 3,000 people. It influenced tens of thousands before it was shut down, but it was based on a terrorist letter committing mass murder, but had managed to convince people that it was justified. Right. You could do that for anything. You could justify the mass murder of Uyghurs in China who are Muslims. You could justify the mass murder of anybody if you own the distribution system of information. And again, hack the mindset of your victim population.
Just a final thought. As someone with extensive military experience, I want to put this to you. As we've seen, a 20-year-old man with a rifle in Pennsylvania was just millimeters away from overturning the political landscape in America, and led to immediate accusations between the parties about the use of incendiary language and threats of political violence. So how much does that play into the hands of those who wish to sow chaos in the country? And I wondered, to what degree is the US facing a particularly vulnerable moment in that respect?
Well, this particular incident, I believe, will eventually show that the kid, young man, was radicalized in the exact same way that we used to complain about, young boys and girls being radicalized by the Islamic State's ideology. They see something on the internet, it inspires them, it makes them want to do something and become part of a structure. The Islamic State, on the other hand, would ask you to join the jihad by bringing you physically from where you are to another country and becoming part of that network. This is how can I put it? This is sort of like a virtual world where you don't have to leave your house. You just acquire the negative ideologies, right? Like this young man, we don't know precisely what set him off. Right. He was very conservative. He was a registered Republican. He was a loner on issues that were socially conservative in his classroom. But at the same time, we don't know whether he wanted to be like John Hinckley, the man who shot Ronald Reagan twice, shot his Secret Service officer twice and his press secretary once, because he wanted to impress the actress Jodie Foster.
Right.
So I don't know if this young man wanted to impress Taylor Swift by killing Donald Trump, was suffering clearly a mental health breakdown. But on the other hand, 5 months ago, Alex Jones, along with a former Special Forces colonel, came out there and were discussing in this very conservative, very well-followed conspiracy theory website video, saying the best thing that could happen to the Republicans is assassinating Donald Trump, because that would mobilize the conservatives to wipe liberal America off the face of the map, which is insane, right? But this kid may have watched that and taken it to heart. We just don't know yet.
Malcolm Nance, there's always so much to talk about. Hope we get a chance to talk some more. Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
London. Oh, London. It is known as the world's financial capital, along with New York, and is also Europe's cultural hub. More than 300 languages are spoken in London. The city houses many famous luxury hotels, but there are many cheaper accommodations too. You can try the hostels, a comfortable B&B, or even camping. London is home to the most amazing attractions in the world, and there are many ways to view it. See the city from above and get a panoramic view of the iconic skyline via the London Eye or view from the Shard. The Thames also makes for a stunning backdrop to the city's known attractions. You can take the river bus services or river tours to beat the traffic and see wonderful sights at the same time. Schedule trips to London's canals, including Regent's Canal and Little Venice. Have a look at the world's most precious treasures at the British Museum. Bump into a famous celebrity at Madame Tussauds, or meet the dinosaurs at the Natural History Museum. Many of London's best museums and galleries are actually free. You can spend time browsing through the British Museum, Natural History Museum, or the Science Museum at no cost. For clean and green spaces, London boasts of 8 royal parks, including Hyde Park and Richmond Park. London also houses one of the best theater scenes in the world. You can catch one of the long-running musicals, classic plays, or brand new works making their West End debuts. Expect to see famous faces on the London stage. Meanwhile, you can also take a culinary journey around the world with London's diverse restaurants. Choose from the Michelin-starred restaurants, the gastropubs, the traditional British restaurants, and places for afternoon tea. London is famous for its bar scene. with rooftop bars, riverside pubs, and champagne bars to offer. On a shopping spree, places to visit are the flagship stores on Oxford Street and the gifts and bric-a-brac at London's markets. The city also hosts the best sporting events in the world. Home to English football is the Wembley Stadium. See a match at Lord's Cricket Ground or Wimbledon Lawn Tennis Museum.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics, and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake, and artificial intelligence, they've got to have a vote and a say. It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
my campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern,